Chapter 1. As the sun rose from the east, a rooster crowed, heralding the beginning of a new day in the farm. Every family woke up from their sleep. The women started to boil water and cook, while the men carried water or tidied up farm tools, preparing to start the day's work after eating. This was a village under the jurisdiction of Lianqing in Jin country. There were about 300 to 400 people in the village, all of whom had one surname and belonged to one clan. Therefore, this village was named Mo's village after their surname. On the east side of the village there were several houses scattered around. Among them, a brick house with a single-door courtyard was very conspicuous among these mud houses. It was conspicuous because the materials used to build it were obviously much better than those of the other houses. The roof tiles were thick and the bricks on the walls were neat. At first glance, one could tell it wasn't built with the local method. The courtyard walls were also not made of random branches or rattan like those of the other mud houses. Instead, they were made of fine bamboo strips. However, it was more dilapidated than the other houses. The roof tiles were broken and no one cleaned them up. The courtyard walls were broken and the vegetable fields in the courtyard were messy. At that moment, the door of the small courtyard was opened. A little girl with a yellow complexion and a pigtail walked out. She was about 6 or 7 years old. She was very thin, had a sickly complexion, and her clothes were old. However, her whole body was neat and tidy. Her hair was combed neatly, and her clothes were also very clean. She pulled up the chicken coop and drove the chickens out. Then she walked to the kitchen in the side room, opened the door, and washed her face with cold water. After washing her face and rinsing her mouth, she rolled up her sleeves and measured a handful of rice. She scooped some water from the water jar and washed it. Then she moved a small stool to the stove, stood on the stool, and put the rice into the big pot to start the fire. Lianqing was located in the south of Jin country. It had a mild climate and was very suitable for growing rice, so people used rice stalks to start the fire. Fortunately, this was the case. Otherwise, how could a girl of her age chop firewood? Before long, the main room's door opened and a pale woman walked into the kitchen. The little girl who was cooking the fire immediately jumped up. "Mother, why did you get up? Go rest for a while. Dinner will be ready soon." The woman smiled and stroked the little girl's head. "Tienga, mother will do these things. You can go play." "No," the little girl insisted and pulled her mother into the room. "Mother, you can't stand the wind. I can do these things. This is just a small matter, I'll do the small things. Mother, do you want to faint and make me worry?" The woman was speechless. The little girl said, "Mother, you should rest well. When you get better, I won't have to do this anymore." The naivety in Mo Chenga's words made the woman smile, but her smile was also mixed with bitterness. Her tone softened. "All right, mother will get better as soon as possible. I won't let Chenga suffer anymore in the future." Red light shone from the east, and the porridge began to emit the fragrance of rice. The little girl sat on a small stool and carefully scooped 2 bowls. She also scooped some pickled vegetables from a jar in the corner of the room and brought them to the main room one by one. Bland porridge, pickles, and no other dishes. One was a patient and the other was a child. No wonder there was no redness on their faces. The woman looked at her daughter with a pained expression. The little girl did not see it and continued to eat her porridge. After breakfast, the woman tidied up her daughter again before taking down the cloth bag hanging on the wall. She hung it on her daughter's shoulder and said, "When you go to school, listen to the teacher and study hard." "Okay, I'm going to school." The sun gradually rose. The little girl stepped on the dew and went to the ancestral hall in the west of the village. From time to time, boys ran and played on the road. Upon seeing her walking on the road, a boy about 10 years old secretly followed her. All of a sudden, he dashed forward, grabbed her braid and pulled it. He burst into laughter and said, "Mo Chenga, your braid is really ugly. You better shave your head." Right after he said that, he once again ran away like a wisp of smoke. Mo Chenga, who had her braid pulled, glared at him. "Give me back my hair rope." The child made a funny face. "Give it back to you? Why should I give it back to you? If you have the ability, come and take it from me." How could a child bear this provocation? Mo Chenga swung her braid and chased after the boy. "Ah, you're so stupid. I'm here." The boy was very flexible and strong. How could her thin and weak body compare to him? Every time he turned around he would throw her off, which made her furious. Soon, Mo Chenga was out of breath from chasing him. At that moment, a girl's voice came from behind. "Brother, what are you doing?" Hearing this voice, the two of them stopped. A girl about 7 or 8 years old ran towards them. When she saw Mo Chenga's messy braid, she immediately glared at her brother. "Brother, don't bully Tienga. Give it back." The boy, who was fierce a moment ago, suddenly showed a bitter expression. I was just teasing her. The girl raised her eyebrows and glared at her brother. You're still talking. If you don't give it back, I'll go home and tell father that you bullied my little sister. The boy's expression became even more bitter. What kind of little sister is she? She doesn't live with us. Our grandfather, Chenga, also calls him grandfather. Why can't she be his little sister? If you say one more word, I'll go home and tell father. Fine, I'll give it back to you. The boy stuffed the hair rope in his hand and hurriedly walked away. After he left, Mo Chenga whispered, Tianxiao, thank you. Mo Tianxiao smiled. No need to thank me. It's his fault. Here, I'll give it back to you. Mo Chenga took the hair rope and tied her braid carelessly. Let me do it. Mo Tianxiao saw that she tied it carelessly, so she simply untied her braid and redid it. She was half a head taller than Mo Chenga, so Mo Chenga didn't need to squat down to braid her hair. After she finished braiding her hair, Mo Tianxiao carefully took out a paper package from her pocket and opened it. Chenga, come and eat some pancakes. Mo Chenga took the package from her. It was a sweet potato pancake. She said in a low voice, thank you. She usually didn't have any pastries or candies to eat. Her mother had always been sick. Although she didn't go hungry, she didn't have much food left. She only got some candies when her grandfather bought them during the New Year or other festivals. Tianxiao and her older brother, Tianjun, were her uncle's children. Tianxiao treated her very well and always shared her snacks with her. Let's eat together. And the two of them ate and walked towards the ancestral hall together. The Mo family school was located in the ancestral hall in the west of the village. An old scholar in the village was the teacher of the school and taught the children in the village. Since it was the family school, all the children in the Mo family's village didn't need to pay school fees. However, the villagers had been working in the fields for generations. Most of them only hoped that their children would be able to read a few characters and be able to count and calculate. After the children came to study in the morning, they went to help with the family's work in the afternoon. Only a few children who were entrusted with high hopes stayed until the afternoon. When the two of them entered the ancestral hall, the room was already full of children. The youngest was 6 or 7 years old, while the oldest was 13 or 14 years old. All of them were boys, only the two of them were girls. The common people believed that a woman's virtue was to have no talent. The Mo family school was also like that. Very few of the daughters in the Mo family's village went to school. Most of them helped with the household chores as soon as they could. Only well-off families would send their daughters to school to learn a few characters. Mo Tianxiao was one of them. She was the direct descendant of the Mo family's patriarch. Because she was the eldest granddaughter and had the same mother as the eldest grandson, her family thought highly of her. Not only did they give her the same name as her brother, but they also sent her to school. Mo Tianxiao and Mo Chenga were the only two people in their generation who were named according to seniority. However, Mo Chenga's situation was different. Mo Chenga's mother was originally the fourth daughter of the patriarch's family. Now people called her the fourth lady. She wasn't the daughter of the patriarch's wife. Instead, the patriarch gave birth to her when he was young. Because of that, the family treated her very coldly. Moreover, she was sick in the womb and suffered from minor illnesses all year round, so she was treated coldly. 10 years ago, a scholar came to the village and lived there. He saw her several times and for some reason he asked the patriarch to marry her. Although the patriarch didn't like this daughter, he was afraid the scholar had bad intentions, so he asked the scholar to marry into the family and stay in the village. Unexpectedly, the scholar didn't object. Soon the two of them got married and lived in the village. Unfortunately, in the 3rd year the scholar had to go on a long journey and never came back. Because her father never came back, she was the only child. Mo Chenga not only had the surname Mo, but her name also followed her seniority. She had always been raised as a boy. While the classroom was in a mess, a cough came from inside the classroom. The children in the classroom immediately quieted down. A dignified old master with half of his hair and beard walked out. Seeing that all the students were sitting obediently and no one was making noise, the old master nodded with satisfaction. He took a book from the table and said, "Have you memorized the first paragraph of yesterday's rules for disciples?" The classroom became even quieter. These children only wanted to learn how to read. How could they study seriously? It would be good if they could learn half of the 10 words they were taught. The old master frowned and called out, "Mo Tianjun, you recite it." Mo Tianjun hastily stood up, but his face was wrinkled. He didn't have the arrogance and complacency he had when he bullied Mo Chenga a moment ago. He began to recite while stammering, "When your parents call, you must not delay. When your parents order, you must not be lazy. When your parents teach, you must listen respectfully. When your parents blame, you must obey. The old master nodded. That's right. Continue. Warm in winter, cool in summer. Calm in the morning, calm in the evening. When you go out, you must. At this point he scratched his ears and cheeks for a while, but he couldn't recite it no matter how hard he tried. He secretly raised his head to look at the old master's face, but when he saw the old master's solemn expression, he hastily lowered his head again. The old master snorted and said, "What did you do last night? Why did you recite so little?" Mo Tianjun hummed and didn't dare to answer. And hearing this, Mo Tianjun's face was as bitter as a gallbladder, but he didn't dare to disobey the old master. He could only step forward and carefully stretch out his left hand. The old master's skinny hand held the ruler and patted Mo Tianjun's palm. Mo Tianjun was startled, but he simply spread out his hand and turned his head away. He raised the ruler high and heavily hit Mo Tianjun's palm. All the children in the classroom didn't dare to make a sound, afraid that they would be the next one. After 5 hits, Mo Tianjun's palm was already red. The old master put away the ruler and said, "Next, Mo Tianwei." Yes. Another child stood up and began to recite. When your parents call, you must not delay. When your parents order, you must not be lazy. When your parents teach, you must obey respectfully. When your parents are responsible, you must obey. The child stumbled and finally finished reciting. The old master finally relaxed his brows. Go back and memorize it. Next. Feeling Tianxiao moving around, Mo Tiange asked in a low voice, "Tianxiao, what's wrong?" Mo Tianxiao's face was bitter and she also replied in a low voice, "I'm also not familiar with it. I don't know if I can recite it later." Hurry up and memorize it now. It's not too late. You're right. Mo Tianxiao quickly opened the book and recited in her heart. Mo Tiange. Mo Tiange hurriedly stood up. Yes, old master. She thought for a moment and began to recite, when your parents call, you must not delay. When your parents order, you must not be lazy. When your parents teach, you must obey respectfully. When your parents are responsible, you must obey respectfully. When winter is warm, summer is cold. When morning is clear, dusk is calm. When you go out, you must report. When you live, you must not change. After mourning for 3 years, you often weep with sorrow. When you live, you must eat and drink. When you mourn, you must be sincere. When you serve the dead, you must serve the living. A slight smile appeared on the old master's face. Good, you've memorized it well. Today you can start reading. When you live, you must be younger. Yes, old master. She breathed a sigh of relief and opened the book to read the next paragraph. Although the children of the Mo family didn't care whether they studied well or badly, the old master had the temperament of a scholar and was very strict with his studies. It wasn't easy to get his praise. Chapter 2. At noon, Mo Tiange went back to the ancestral hall to make lunch. In the morning, the old master taught all the children in the clan how to read, but in the afternoon, only the children with high hopes came. Since Mo Tiange was a woman, she couldn't take the imperial exam, and it was inconvenient for her to work in the city. Originally, she didn't need to learn much. However, the old master admired her father's knowledge very much, so he treated her differently. In addition, her mother also thought that since her father was knowledgeable, she should also study more instead of being like an ordinary village girl, wasting her time on domestic trifles. The afternoon lessons were much more casual than the morning lessons. The 5 or 6 children were either reading or practicing calligraphy by themselves or being taught by the old master alone. Mo Tiange came in, saluted the old master, and then entered the library. The Mo family wasn't a big family. The ancestral hall only had a main hall, a courtyard, and east and west wing rooms. The main hall enshrined the spirits of the ancestors. The backyard was a place for drinking wine in the ancestral hall during the new year. The front half of the east wing was changed into a school, the back half was a library, and several lonely old people lived in the west wing. Usually they were responsible for guarding the ancestral hall. The library wasn't big. There were 6 bookshelves against the wall, and there were thousands of books passed down through the generations of the Mo family. Mo Tiange pulled a stool to the east. The books on this bookshelf were all travel notes. They were written in common words and had many pictures, which were suitable for children who had just started school like her. The old master didn't say anything about her liking to read these miscellaneous books. As a woman, it didn't matter what books she read since she couldn't take the imperial exam. Mo Tiange picked a book, found a dictionary of the Great Gene and put it on the side. Then she sat by the window and started reading. This book was called Brief Notes on the Celestial Pole. It was said that the world was so big that there were countless lands and oceans. The one they lived in was called the Celestial Pole. The Celestial Pole was so big that it included Jean and a dozen other countries, big and small. There was a vast forest in the northeast, a desert in the west, a glacier in the north, and a continuous mountain range in the south. This book recorded the strange people and stories of the Celestial Pole. According to legend, there was a mountain range at the southern end of the Celestial Pole called Kunwu. From east to west, Kunwu stretched for thousands of miles. Since ancient times, no one had been able to pass through it. Mortals who were not far from the mountain range could occasionally see the purple clouds in the mountains, flickering with 5 colors. If they went into the mountains to search, they would be lost in the clouds. Only by turning back could they find the way out. Gradually, people began to say that this mountain was an immortal mountain, and that only immortals could enter. The immortals who lived on Kunwu Mountain absorbed dew in the morning and devoured the essence of the moon at night. They could go up to the heavens and go down to the earth. They were omnipotent. If they found someone with spiritual roots in the mortal world, they would bring them back to the celestial mountain to cultivate. Once they succeeded, they would become immortals. Once they became immortals, they could summon clouds and rain with a flip of their hands. They could travel thousands of miles on clouds, move mountains and drain seas, fly up into the sky and dive into the ground. They could also maintain a youthful appearance and live forever. There was no one in this world who did not wish to enter the celestial mountain and refine the celestial bone. Unfortunately, the spiritual root was hard to find. As for the celestials, most people had only heard of them in legends. This book recorded a story. In ancient times, there was a monarch of the state of Chu who was passionate about the Tao and wanted to cultivate to become an immortal. He summoned all the Taoists in the world to the capital and found a person with profound Tao to be his teacher. Just as the Taoists of the state of Chu were competing in the Tao, a beggar covered in dirt walked into the Tao field and said, "You all are not fit to carry my shoes." The Taoists were furious, but the beggar laughed heartily. He raised his finger, and a deep pool suddenly appeared in the center of the Tao platform. With another wave of his hand, the deep pool disappeared and a great fire ignited. Everyone present was shocked. The king of Chu wanted to make him the teacher of the state, but the beggar disappeared like a cloud of dust. It was also recorded that there was a scholar in the state of Liang who came from a poor family. He studied hard and finally became the Zhuangyuan. However, at the Jasper Forest banquet, he offended the nobles of the court and was sent to manage the Hanlin Academy's library. The dignified Zhuangyuan stayed in the library for 10 years without a bright future. However, 10 years later, because he found an immortal technique in the library, he comprehended the Tao in one night. When the nobles that he offended learned about this, they panicked, but the Zhuangyuan just laughed it off and left with the wind. Mo Chenga was reading with relish when someone suddenly stood in front of her. She looked up, closed the book and stood up. "Master." The old master nodded, took the book from her hand and flipped through a few pages. He asked, "Do you know everything?" Mo Chenga replied, "I didn't know some words, so I looked them up in the dictionary. As for the ones I couldn't find, I wrote them down and will ask you next time." The old master handed the book to her. "Good. Reading more is the best way to learn characters. You can continue." "Yes, master." The sun was setting in the west. Mo Chenga put the book back on the shelf and went out to clean the school. The other children had already gone back, and the old master had gone to the back hall to eat. She was the only one in the front hall. After wiping the tables, sweeping the floor and taking out the garbage, she stopped when she passed by the back door of the hall. There seemed to be light inside. After looking for a while, she put down the dustpan and went closer. Women were not allowed to enter the ancestral hall. Even if they were married, the husband must enter the ancestral hall first. Therefore, Mo Chenga had never entered the hall with the memorial tablets. At this time the door of the hall was closed. The hazy light seemed to be light, but it also seemed like smoke. She couldn't see clearly. She looked around and found no one was around. After hesitating for a while, she couldn't help but put the dustpan aside and sneak in. The hall was very high and the door was closed. The whole room was dark except for the faint light coming through the window lattice and the light from the back door. She cautiously approached and found that the light seemed to come from the memorial tablets at the top. Rows of memorial tablets were placed in the hall. There were about 40 to 50 of them, and even the walls on both sides were filled with them. It looked very scary. Mo Chenga somewhat flinched, but as soon as she came in, the light became even brighter. She couldn't control her curiosity. She looked up and found that there was only one memorial tablet on the top floor. The memorial tablet was white and looked like jade. There was a white jade statue of a Lord of Tao in her grandfather's house. But this memorial tablet was even whiter, and there seemed to be white mist like white gas floating above it. Mo Chenga looked around, then moved a chair from the corner and put it next to the memorial tablet. She stepped on it and found that it was just high enough. She carefully reached out to grab the memorial tablet. She was short, so she almost had to lean half of her body on the table to get the memorial tablet. It was a bit cold. The white gas permeated her hand so she could see it clearly. Mo Chenga turned the memorial tablet over and saw these words on it. Mo Yaoqing's memorial tablet. There was only one name which was different from the others. The white gas became thicker and thicker, even starting to submerge her body. She stared at the memorial tablet and found that the white light was also getting brighter. The light was originally white, but it gradually became bright. She couldn't help but widen her eyes when she witnessed such a magical thing. The light suddenly flashed and entered the space between her eyebrows. She jumped in fright and her eyes suddenly lost focus. Then she slowly closed her eyes and fell from the chair. Chapter 3. In the endless darkness, her body seemed to be bobbing up and down in the water. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't catch anything. She was so scared. She wanted to call her mother, but she couldn't. All of a sudden her body stopped. A light appeared in front of her, so she looked around hastily. There was nothing, not even walls. It was empty except for this light that came from nowhere. She heard a faint sigh that made her hair stand on end. She was startled. "Oh, who's here?" The voice stopped for a while and said, "After so many years, a descendant finally triggered the restriction. The art of Sunu finally has a successor." The voice was neither near nor far. It seemed to be echoing in the air, but she couldn't find its source. She looked around, but she only heard a chuckle. "Silly child, you can't find me. I'm just a divine sense sealed in this restriction." The voice was fleeting, gentle, and beautiful. It was actually a very pleasant female voice. Mo Chenga stared at this space with fear and said in a trembling voice, "Who are you?" "Me." The female voice sighed faintly. "I'm your ancestor. My name is Mo Yaoqing." What divine sense? Mo Chenga didn't understand the first part, but she understood the second part. Mo Yaoqing was the name on the memorial tablet she saw. She was the ancestor of the Mo family. Wasn't that a ghost? This thought scared her. After a long time she asked in a trembling voice, You're a ghost?" She once heard from the adults in the village that when people died, they would become ghosts. "Ghost? The female voice laughed and asked sternly, "Do you know that there are cultivators in this world?" Without waiting for her answer, the female voice said to herself, "Presumably you don't know. How could a child living among mortals know about these things?" Then she said, "Since you triggered the restriction, it means you inherited my purine constitution and have spiritual roots. Let me see how your spiritual roots are." Suddenly a gust of wind blew. Mo Chenga was startled. She felt something invisible covering her body and moving around, but she couldn't move. After a while the thing on her body loosened. The female voice was surprised. 5 elements spiritual roots? Moreover, they are equally strong and weak. Could it be that you also inherited that boy's primordial epic spirit root? What 5 elements spiritual roots of the origin? Mo Chenga didn't understand at all. She just felt that this was her clan's ancestor. It didn't seem to have any malice towards her, so it wasn't an evil spirit, right? The voice sighed faintly again. "I didn't expect that a child would inherit our aptitudes at the same time. This is truly the will of the heavens. Unfortunately, I don't know if that kid is dead or not, and his primordial chaos cultivation technique isn't in my hands, so I can't pass it on to my descendants. Child, do you know that if the people of this world cultivate to become immortals, they will have the ability to fly in the sky and burrow into the earth, and they will not age?" At this explanation, she recalled the book she had seen in the library. The immortals who lived on Kunwu Mountain absorbed dew in the morning and consumed the essence of the moon in the evening. They could go up to the heavens and enter the earth. They were omnipotent. You mean the immortals on Kunwu Mountain?" "Oh." The voice sounded surprised. "You've heard of it before?" This ancestor's ghost seemed to be very kind to her, so she became a bit bolder. "I read a book in school. It said there are immortals on Kunwu Mountain. They're omnipotent and can even live forever." The female voice laughed again. "People exaggerate, but it's not far from the truth. If you can achieve the great Tao, you're indeed omnipotent and can live forever. However, nowadays there aren't many people who can cultivate to the nascent soul realm. Even with my aptitude, I had to rack my brains and obtain fated chances to advance to the nascent soul realm. Unfortunately, I wasted 1,000 years after I advanced to the nascent soul realm, and in the end I didn't advance to the deification realm. I could only die in meditation and seal this strand of divine sense in a jade tablet, waiting for my descendants to trigger the restriction and pass on this cultivation technique. Seeing that Mo Tienga was confused, the ghost stopped talking and asked her again, "Child, do you want to be like those immortals, omnipotent and able to fly in the sky and burrow into the earth?" Mo Tienga blinked. "Does that mean I can cure my mother's illness and also find my father?" "And?" The female voice was puzzled. "What happened to your mother? Where's your father?" Mo Tienga lowered her head and said gloomily, "My mother has always been sick, but she can't be cured. The doctor said she was born with this. Originally, she wouldn't be able to live past the age of 20. Being able to live until now is already very good. My father passed away before I was born. Mother said he had something to do and would come to pick us up later, but he hasn't come." This strand of divine sense was left behind by Mo family's ancestor Mo Yaoqing. Mo Yaoqing was originally a nascent soul expert, so she immediately understood what happened to her mother. Thinking that this person must also be her descendant, she couldn't help but feel sad. A purine body is both a fated chance and a disaster. Your mother must have inherited my purine body. Unfortunately, she didn't have spiritual roots, so she was destined not to live long. Don't be sad. She didn't understand what a purine body was. Hearing this ancestor's ghost say her mother couldn't be saved, although she already knew it, her mood still became gloomy. No matter what, my mother can't be saved. This isn't omnipotent at all. The female voice choked on her words. For a moment she couldn't say anything. After a while she said, "But if you learn the law of immortality, you can go look for your father. Isn't that good?" She had never seen her father. In fact, she really wanted to see what her father looked like, but she was afraid of hurting her mother's heart, so she never asked. Without waiting for her to answer, the female voice seemed to realize something and said sternly, "I'm just a strand of divine sense. Since the restriction has been lifted, I can't exist for too long. Child, listen to me. You'll understand these things when you grow up. Several thousand years ago, I was a cultivator from Yunzhong. Yunzhong is what the celestial pole called Shannon. After crossing Kunwa Mountain and the South Sea, I arrived at Yunzhong. When I was a child, I was discovered to have spiritual roots and a purine body, so I entered the Righteous Path's Danxia sect. With my double spiritual roots and purine body, my cultivation progress wasn't the slightest bit inferior to cultivators with single spiritual roots. When I was 100 years old, I already formed my gold core. I thought my cultivation was successful and my future was limitless. However, I didn't know that the nascent soul martial uncle in the sect had already taken a fancy to my constitution when I entered the sect. He decided to wait until I formed my gold core to perform dual cultivation with his blood-related junior. Mo Tienga didn't understand what the female voice was talking about. She only heard the female voice's sigh at first, but later on, it became angry. The female voice stopped for a while. She seemed to have calmed down before she continued to speak. Later, I suffered untold hardships and escaped from Danxia sect. From then on, I became an individual cultivator. After this incident, I also learned to be cruel and merciless. From then on, whenever a cultivator coveted me, I absorbed all of their power. Because of that, I gradually gained a nickname, which Jinling. After I formed my nascent soul, I wandered around and arrived in the celestial pole. Unfortunately, I was trapped in the middle stage of the nascent soul realm for my entire life. I had no choice but to pass away while sitting cross-legged and seal this strand of divine sense in a memorial tablet, waiting for future generations to have a chance to break through the restriction and pass on the art of Sunu. The art of Sunu is a hidden cultivation technique of my former sect, Danxia sect. Only female cultivators with a purine constitution can practice it. It's said that this cultivation technique even has a chapter for those after the deification realm. Unfortunately, I only have a cultivation technique for those up to the nascent soul realm. If your cultivation is successful in the future, you can go to Yunzhong to look for the rest of it. However, with your spiritual roots, if you can't obtain your other ancestors' cultivation technique, I'm afraid it'll be very difficult for you to reach the nascent soul realm with your cultivation speed. Spiritual roots of the origin without a specific cultivation technique are nothing but trash spiritual roots. Before passing on the cultivation technique, I'll first tell you some common knowledge about cultivation. The so-called cultivation is when mortals with spiritual roots absorb the spiritual aura of heaven and earth. The spiritual aura circulates in their meridians and is stored in their dantian, allowing them to possess magic power. The process of cultivation requires them to cleanse their muscles and marrow, allowing their bodies to expel the filth of the secular world and infinitely approach the standard of a high immortal. Once you cultivate to the extreme, you can become an immortal. In our world, cultivation can only reach the deification realm at most. As for how to break through to the deification realm, no one knows. If you reach the nascent soul realm one day, your knowledge won't be any less than mine. Therefore, I'll first tell you the basic knowledge of cultivation. As for the rest, you'll naturally learn about it when your cultivation is successful. The world we live in is the mortal world, also known as the human world. Our cultivation realms can be divided into 5 major realms. Absorbing spiritual aura into the body and storing it in the dantian is the first stage of cultivation, called aura refining. When the spiritual aura in the dantian reaches a certain level, it will change and be compressed into spiritual liquid. This is the second stage, foundation building. After foundation building, you continue to absorb spiritual aura. When you have enough spiritual liquid, you can continue to compress it and form a golden core. This is the third stage, core formation. When you reach the peak of core formation, the spiritual aura in your body will reach its limit and you won't be able to continue cultivating. Only when your primordial spirit and golden core merge into one and form a nascent soul can you advance a step further. This is called nascent soul. There aren't many people in the mortal world who can cultivate to the nascent soul realm. Nascent soul cultivators have the ability to move mountains and drain the seas. They can be considered immortals on the land. The next stage is called deification. It's when you cultivate your primordial spirit to its limit and temper it to the point where it can't be harmed unless it's a magic weapon from the upper realm. This stage has existed since ancient times, but it's as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns. Even I have been trapped in the nascent soul realm my whole life, unable to advance a step further. His voice was filled with melancholy. Even though Mo Chenga didn't really understand what he meant, she could feel the desolation in his tone. In the future, if you abandon your life in the secular world and step into the cultivation world, you must remember that the difference between the early and late stages of the same realm is huge, not to mention the difference between these major realms. You mustn't provoke people whose cultivation level is higher than yours. The path of cultivation is really dangerous. Although they're afraid of the inner demons brought about by karma and don't dare to kill in vain, if there's enough profit to drive them, they can do anything. Besides, you have a purine constitution. You should know that a female cultivator with a purine constitution is hard to find even in 1,000 years. For male cultivators, dual cultivation has many benefits. Once a female cultivator appears, she'll definitely attract many male cultivators to fight over her. In the past, I didn't even know how much effort I put in to ensure my own safety. At this point, the female voice sighed, seeming to have become a lot weaker. I'm going to disappear soon, so I'll pass on my cultivation technique to you. Unfortunately, I can't give you the things I had in the past. Only when your cultivation level is high enough will you be able to possess the corresponding wealth. Once you've mastered your cultivation technique, you can go look for the things I accumulated in the past. Mo Chenga was confused, but right at this moment she suddenly felt a pain in her head. In an instant, a lot of things drilled into her brain. Remember, female cultivators with purine constitution are the human furnaces that male cultivators yearn for even in their dreams. If you can't conceal your constitution, you must never step into the cultivation world. Chapter 4. Chenga Chenga. Mo Chenga heard her mother crying. She opened her eyes in a daze. Chenga. The Mo family's fourth lady cried tears of joy. You're finally awake. Her eyes slowly focused and she called out blankly, Mother. Mother is here. Do you feel uncomfortable? Tell Mother quickly. She looked confused and touched her belly. I'm so hungry. The fourth lady was stunned for a moment. Then she smiled with tears in her eyes. Child, you rashly ran into the ancestral hall and even fell from the chair. Even the headmaster was frightened by you. But you, as soon as you woke up, you only knew that you were hungry. Mother is going to cook for you. Wait a moment. She nodded. The fourth lady hurriedly went to the kitchen, but when she stepped out of the door, her vision suddenly blurred. She hastily supported herself against the wall, and it took a long time for her pale face to recover. Mo Chenga stood up and looked around. Nothing had changed. She couldn't help but hold her chin and say to herself, was it a dream? As soon as she thought about it, many strange words and gestures suddenly appeared in her mind, frightening her. Those words were very strange and completely different from what she had learned, but she didn't know why, but she instinctively recognized them. Is it true? She slowly recalled everything in her dream. She didn't understand many words, but those words were deeply engraved in her mind. Immortals. Are there really immortals in this world? Can I also become an immortal and fly in the sky? But when she remembered that ancestor said her mother couldn't be saved, her expression became gloomy again. Footsteps came from outside the house. Someone entered the courtyard. Fourth lady, are you cooking? Mo Chinga recognized it was Aunt Wang's voice from next door. Then she heard her mother's gentle voice. Yes, Chinga fainted and hasn't eaten for 2 days. She's starving. Aunt Wang said with a smile. Child woke up? That's good. We don't have anything valuable in our house. These eggs and fruits are for Chinga to nourish her body. Ah, you look so pale. Come, sit down and rest for a while. I'll do it. How can I do that? Sister-in-law always gives us her own eggs. How can we trouble you? That's nothing. Cooking a few side dishes is a small matter. Your family has helped us a lot in the past. Back then, when my husband rolled down the mountain, it was thanks to fourth son-in-law's help that he didn't become a cripple. You don't have to be so polite. Mo Chinga knew the fourth son-in-law was talking about her father. She had heard bits and pieces that her father was not only knowledgeable, but he also had medical skills. Although he looked like a scholar, his strength was greater than others. Uncle Wang said it was because he knew kung fu. In the few years that her father had lived in the village, the villagers didn't need to look for outsiders to see a doctor. Her father would even help build a house or dig a well. She then heard Auntie Wang say, Chinga, this child? How could a girl enter the ancestral hall? Fortunately, everyone didn't make a fuss because she was young and hit her head. How is she now? Is her head all right? You said you were hungry when you woke up. It shouldn't be a problem. That's good. But in that case, how are you going to take care of Chinga with your body? Did your family ask you to go back? Her mother didn't say anything. Chinga didn't need to think to know that she didn't. Her grandmother didn't like her mother and she didn't like her either. Her uncles weren't close to her mother, and her grandfather was also very cold to them. In that family, aside from Tian Xiao who was good to her, the others didn't like her. Auntie Wang was right. Her mother was so sick, so how could she take care of her? She had to get better and take care of her mother. She braced herself and jumped out of bed, but her head was dizzy again. Many things were flying around in her head. She knew it was something left behind by the ancestor who talked to her. It was something called the art of Sunu. She didn't really understand it, but she seemed to know what to do. The door was pushed open. The fourth lady and Auntie Wang walked in with their respective dishes. Upon seeing her, Auntie Wang smiled. Chinga, you can get out of bed now. How are you? Does your head hurt? Mo Chinga shook her head. I'm fine, Auntie Wang. That's good. Come and eat. You haven't eaten for 2 days. You must be starving, right? Mo Chinga nodded. She turned around and saw her mother putting the dishes on the table. She said, Chinga, come and eat. Seeing her mother's pale face, Mo Chinga was a bit worried. Mother, what's wrong? Are you feeling unwell? The fourth lady shook her head and smiled reassuringly. Don't worry. I just didn't rest well. I'll be fine after a while. Mo Chinga didn't suspect anything and took the food her mother handed her. Her mother said she hadn't eaten for 2 days. She didn't feel anything just now, but now that she smelled the food, she realized she was really hungry. Seeing her wolfing down the food, the fourth lady and Auntie Wang couldn't help but smile at each other. Slow down. No one's fighting with you. Be careful or you'll choke. Now that she had something in her stomach, Mo Chinga slowed down. She raised her head and said, Mother's cooking is delicious. Auntie Wang's fried green beans are also fragrant. Her words made the two adults laugh. Auntie Wang chatted for a while before she finally left. Before she left, she said to the fourth lady, although Chinga has woken up, we don't know if there's anything wrong with her. We should ask the doctor to come and take a look. The fourth lady nodded. I just hate that my body isn't good enough. I'll have to trouble Brother Wang to call another doctor. What are you talking about? A close neighbor is better than a distant relative. We should help each other. In the afternoon, I'll ask my husband to go to town. You can rest at home. I'll go back now. Yes. Take care, sister-in-law. Right after seeing off Auntie Wang, the fourth lady found her little niece had come. Tianxiao, why are you here? Mo Tianxiao answered timidly, Fourth aunt, how's Chinga? I came to see her. Because the fourth lady had always been sick, the family didn't allow her to come over, so Tianxiao was very unfamiliar with this aunt. Chinga woke up. You're really considerate. Come in and sit. And? Seeing Mo Tianxiao coming in after her mother, Chinga jumped up. Tianxiao. Chinga, eat your food. The fourth lady looked at her reproachfully, then said to Emo Tianxiao with a smile, "Tianxiao, sit for a while. I'll make you a bowl of noodles. Do you want to eat long noodles or dragon whisker noodles?" Emo Tianxiao shook her head immediately. "Fourth aunt, there's no need. I already ate." Her family said she couldn't eat at her fourth aunt's house. Although she didn't take it seriously, she couldn't be too casual when she was a guest. The fourth lady didn't force her. She went to the kitchen to pick up some fruits Auntie Wang gave her, washed them and brought them over. "Eat some plums. These are freshly picked fresh plums from Auntie Wang next door." Emo Tianxiao immediately thanked her. "Thank you, fourth aunt." Seeing her being so polite, the fourth lady praised her a few more times before entering the inner room to let the two children talk. "Tinga, how did you fall in the ancestral hall? I heard my father said you even broke the memorial tablets of the ancestors." Emo Chinga was about to tell her what she saw, but she hesitated. "I wasn't careful. Grandpa was very angry when he heard about it. He said it was disrespectful to the ancestors. A girl entered the ancestral hall and broke the memorial tablets of the ancestors. Grandpa wanted to punish you, but other grandpa said you were still young and insensible, so there was no need to punish you. Grandpa didn't get angry anymore." Hearing that she made Grandpa angry, Emo Chinga lowered her head and ate. She was very afraid of Grandpa because Grandpa didn't like her mother or her. "But it's all right now. Where did you hit yourself? Does it still hurt?" "My head still hurts a little, but I'm fine." Thinking of the memorial tablets she broke, she felt a bit confused. "Tianxiao, why can't girls enter the ancestral hall? The ancestor on the top is obviously a girl, right?" "Huh. How did you know?" "I saw the name. It should be a girl's name." Originally, she would tell Tianxiao anything, but she didn't know why, but she felt it was better not to tell others about such an inconceivable thing. Especially since that person said her mother couldn't be saved, she didn't want her mother to know. "I also don't know. I'll go back and ask Grandpa." "Forget it. Don't ask, otherwise Grandpa will get angry again." Emo Tianxiao thought about it and agreed, so she didn't ask anymore. Instead, she asked her, "When will you go to school?" "I'll go tomorrow. I'm fine now." "That's good. I have something fun. I'll bring it to the school tomorrow." Okay. In the afternoon, Uncle Wang went to town to invite a doctor. Seeing that Emo Chenga was alive and kicking, he took her pulse and said she didn't need to take any medicine. The fourth lady finally felt relieved. She went to the kitchen and cooked a plate of vegetables and fried tofu with minced meat. She also asked Aunt Wang to buy some pig trotters from the butcher in the village and made a pot of pig trotters soup. Seeing this, Emo Chenga was very hungry. It was rare to see meat at home, let alone so many good dishes. The fourth lady gave Emo Chenga some pig trotters soup and asked her to take it to the next door. The mother and daughter had a good dinner and went to bed to rest. Chapter 5. Emo Chenga slept all the way until early in the morning. She immediately crawled out of bed. After a night's sleep, her head didn't hurt anymore and she felt very energetic. She put on her clothes and got out of bed. She saw that her mother had already woken up and was leaning against the bedside with a needle and thread in her hand. Emo Chenga pushed her. "Mother, if you didn't sleep well, go to bed." The fourth lady didn't move. Emo Chenga pushed her hard. "Mother." Before she could finish her sentence, she saw the fourth lady fall from the bedpost and fall headfirst onto the bed. Emo Chenga was startled and hastily rushed to her. The fourth lady's eyes were closed and her face was frighteningly pale. Emo Chenga finally saw that there was blood on the corner of her mouth and her clothes were dyed red. "Mother." Emo Chenga panicked. She jumped up and ran madly outside. Just as she ran out of the small courtyard, she bumped into Aunt Wang, who had just walked out of the courtyard. Ouch. Before Aunt Wang could ask what happened, she heard Emo Chenga crying and shouting, "Aunt Wang, my mother fainted and vomited blood. What should I do? What should I do?" Aunt Wang was also startled by what she said. She hastily said, "Chenga, don't worry. Let Aunt take a look at her." She followed Emo Chenga back to her room and saw the fourth lady lying on the bed with blood flowing on the quilt. She hastily said, "Ask your Uncle Wang to call a doctor." Emo Chenga wiped her face and ran next door to call Uncle Wang, who was eating. Hearing that her mother fainted, Uncle Wang pushed his bowl away and hurried to town. When Emo Chenga returned home, she saw that Aunt Wang had helped the fourth lady to the bed. Seeing her mother's lifeless eyes closed, Emo Chenga burst into tears. Aunt Wang hugged her for a long time to comfort her. 2 hours later, Uncle Wang came in with a doctor. Emo Chenga looked at him anxiously, her tears falling incessantly. A moment later the doctor stood up and shook his head. This lady was born weak and exhausted. This time her heart disease is acting up. I'm afraid she won't be able to live past tonight. Please send her home." Finished speaking, he didn't ask for the consultation fee, picked up his medicine box and left. Aunt Wang had long known that the fourth lady wouldn't be able to hold on for much longer. She sighed and called Uncle Wang, "Go to the chief's house and report the news." Uncle Wang sighed, shook his head and went out. Aunt Wang stared at the unconscious fourth lady, then at Mo Chenga, who was crying for her mother on the side. She sighed and said, "Poor child. She's going to lose her mother at such a young age." The sky gradually darkened. Mo Chenga no longer had any tears. She sat on the bed in a daze and stared at her mother. During this period of time, Grandpa's uncles and aunts came one after another. In the end, Grandpa and Grandma also came. After seeing the situation, they went out to make arrangements. Her tears dried up, but her mother did not wake up. She knew what the doctor meant. If she couldn't make it, she would die. Mother said that when you die, you will sleep forever. You will never wake up again. You will be buried in the ground, and in the end you will also become soil. She felt the palm under her hand move and quickly looked over, only to see her mother's eyelids move as if she was about to wake up. "Mother, mother," she hastily called. Aunt Wang saw her and hurriedly came over. "Fourth lady?" The fourth lady opened her eyes. When she saw Mo Chenga, tears gushed out of her eyes. However, she didn't have the strength to raise her hand, so she could only stare at her. "Fourth lady," Aunt Wang said in a low voice, "if you have any unfulfilled wishes, just tell me." The fourth lady looked at the deserted room. She understood that even in death, none of her so-called family members cared about her. She looked at Mo Chenga with pity, feeling more and more bitter in her heart. She also lost her mother when she was a child. She never expected that Mo Chenga would suffer the same fate as her. Seeing her trembling lips, Aunt Wang hastily moved closer. She only vaguely heard the two words Chenga, and asked, "Fourth lady, you're worried about Chenga, aren't you?" She nodded with tears in her eyes. "Rest assured. I'll take care of her for you." She then moved her gaze away and stared fixedly at one place. Aunt Wang followed her gaze and brought back the dressing box. "Fourth lady, are you talking about this?" Seeing that Mo Chenga nodded and wanted to say something, Aunt Wang moved closer to her ear and heard some words. Aunt Wang then opened the box. There were several good pieces of jewelry inside. She knew the fourth lady was very capable in those days, so it wasn't strange for him to have these pieces. She picked them up one by one, watching the fourth lady's expression. When she picked up a glass bead bracelet, she saw the change in the fourth lady's expression and lowered her head to listen to what she said. She then asked, "Is this the fourth lady's?" The fourth lady nodded with difficulty and looked at Mo Chenga, who was crying silently. "Mother, mother." Mo Chenga shouted hoarsely. The fourth lady passed out again. That night, the fourth lady was unconscious, but in the end she couldn't hold on. When it was almost dawn, she finally lost her breath. The patriarch of the Mo clan came to check on her but left before she could close her eyes. Several sisters-in-law also came to check on her, but they were waiting to deal with the funeral. Mo Chenga just held her mother's hand tightly. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she was in a daze. Until she could no longer feel her body temperature, she cried until she passed out. 3 days later, the fourth lady was buried. Mo Chenga was always in a daze. Sometimes she was taken care of by Aunt Wang, and sometimes she was accompanied by Mo Tianxiao. After the funeral came back and the mourning hall was cleaned up, the people of the Mo clan began to make arrangements for the fourth lady's funeral. When the fourth lady looked for a son-in-law, she also divided the family like a son. Although she didn't get as much as the other sons, she deliberately built this courtyard and was given more than 10 acres of good farmland. All these years, the mother and daughter lived and took medicine on these acres of farmland. Since the fourth lady was looking for a son-in-law, the farmland and houses could naturally be passed on. However, Mo Chenga was a daughter. Her parents were gone, so the farmland and houses should naturally be taken back by her cousin. Therefore, the sons of the patriarch were very enthusiastic. Although the property wasn't much, it was still something. They were just local moneybags in the countryside, so they couldn't compare to real big families. The Mo family's patriarch furrowed his brows tightly as he watched his sons quarreling with each other. He gave birth to this daughter outside because he was young and preposterous. In fact, he didn't have many feelings for her. However, she was his blood. Seeing his sons fighting for this little bit of property before their corpses were even cold and arguing in front of him without any regard for his face, the Mo clan's patriarch was extremely unhappy. Seeing that they were fighting more and more unreasonably, the Mo clan's patriarch knocked his tobacco pipe on the table leg. The loud sound immediately silenced everyone. The Mo clan's patriarch said with a sullen expression, "The eldest will take care of the farmland first. Save the grain we harvest every year and return it to her husband when he comes back. If the child doesn't come back when she's grown up, the grain and several acres of farmland will be considered as dowry. The house will be left behind." Since the Mo clan's patriarch had spoken, the young masters didn't dare to say anything. Seeing that the patriarch handled things fairly, the old villagers didn't have any objections. They only asked, "What about this child? Which family will raise her?" The Mo clan's patriarch said, "Take the child back and treat her as if I'm raising her. We don't need to waste their grain." These words made the faces of the few young masters look embarrassed. The Mo clan's patriarch let out a humph and said, "That's enough. Let's go. Chinga, since your grandfather said so, Auntie can rest assured that you'll have someone to take care of you in the future," Aunt Wang said while folding Mo Chinga's clothes. Mo Chinga sat on the edge of the bed, pressing the string of beads on her wrist. She lowered her head and didn't say anything. Thinking about how she lost her mother at such a young age, Aunt Wang felt sorry for her. She said softly, "Chinga, your mother wants you to be safe and sound. You have to take good care of yourself. Maybe your father will come back at any time." Mo Chinga's expression finally changed when her mother was mentioned. She looked up at Aunt Wang and said, "Aunt Wang, rest assured. I'll be fine. I won't let my mother worry." How was this something a 7-year-old child would say? Aunt Wang felt even more sorry for her. She packed up Mo Chinga's things and said, "Everything's packed. Auntie will take you to your grandfather's house. Don't worry, we'll clean the house every day. I guarantee it'll be clean when your father comes back." Thank you, Aunt Wang. Chapter 6. Mo Chinga lowered her head, enduring the scrutiny of the mean woman sitting on the rattan chair. This was the patriarch's wife, Madame Zheng, Mo Chinga's grandmother in name. However, ever since she was young, she rarely saw her grandmother except for New Year's Day. After a long time, Madame Zheng snorted and said to the servant woman on the side, "Aunt Lin, clean up the room next to the kitchen for her to live in. Take her out to help clean up." The sturdy middle-aged woman responded and said coldly to Mo Chinga, "Come here." Mo Chinga still lowered her head and followed Aunt Lin out of the room. In the entire Mo family's village, there were only 5 or 6 well-off families. The patriarch's family could be regarded as a local tycoon. They owned hundreds of acres of good farmland, built a large house and had several servants to do rough work. The young masters of the Mo family split up after they got married, leaving only the eldest young master to inherit the family business. The room next to the kitchen was originally a grocery room. Mo Chinga followed Aunt Lin to move the sundries out and clean the room. Aunt Lin moved a few pieces of old furniture and put them in the room. She also fetched bedding and bed curtains from somewhere and left after putting them on the bed. Mo Chinga sat in the room for a while before she started to look around. This room had always been a grocery room and hadn't been repaired. There were several cracks on the walls, it was very humid and there was moss in the corners. Although Aunt Lin had swept the floor, there was still dust everywhere, making it look very old. She got up and went to the courtyard to fetch water to wash the furniture. She was small and weak, so she only carried half a bucket of water. She went to the kitchen and asked for a rag from Aunt Lin, who was cooking, to slowly scrub. As she wiped, her tears started to fall. Her mother was gone and she knew no one cared about her anymore. There weren't many people in this house, but there were many empty rooms, yet they made her live in this kind of room. "Chinga, Chinga." A voice came from outside. Mo Chinga hurriedly wiped her tears. Before she could answer, she saw Mo Tianxiao rushing in from outside. Seeing her wiping the bed, Mo Tianxiao said, "Why do you have to clean it yourself? Where's Aunt Lin?" She was about to go outside to call her. Mo Chinga hurriedly stopped her. "No need. Aunt Lin already helped me clean it. It's me who thinks it's not clean." "Then let her wipe it clean, Tianxiao." Mo Chinga interrupted Mo Tianxiao. After a moment of hesitation, she changed the topic and asked, "Why were you looking for me?" Mo Tianxiao was simple-minded, so her attention was immediately diverted. She picked up the only clean chair and sat down. She said, "I came to see you. In the future we'll live in the same courtyard, so it'll be more convenient for me to look for you to play." Mo Chinga didn't answer. She just threw the rag into the bucket and started to make the bed. Seeing that Mo Tianxiao was struggling, Mo Tianxiao jumped down from the chair and shouted, I'll help you. The two little girls didn't have much strength and didn't know how to do this kind of thing. They just spread out the mattress in a haphazard manner and used it as a mattress. Mo Tianxiao and Aunt Lin really had no choice but to rush out and call for Aunt Lin. Aunt Lin came in and muttered a few words of dissatisfaction before hanging up the account book. Before leaving, she said to Tianxiao, "Miss, it's time to eat. You should go to the dining room first. If eldest young madam knew you were doing this kind of thing, she would scold me." Mo Chinga didn't know what to say, but Mo Tianxiao was very annoyed. This Aunt Lin is really something. Who does she want to show her face to? I just told her to hang up the account book, but she's so talkative. She naturally wouldn't have any complaints about hanging the account book for the master, but what kind of master was she? After these past few days, Mo Chinga knew that aside from Tianxiao, no one in this family would take her seriously, so she just pretended not to hear anything. Moreover, Aunt Lin also reminded her that asking Tianxiao for help would make eldest aunt angry. Mo Chinga said, "You should go eat. Everything's done, so I'll just pack up my luggage." Mo Tianxiao said as if it was a matter of course, "Of course we'll go eat together. You don't have to pack up for now. We'll talk about it later." Mo Chinga was a bit hesitant. She wasn't sure whether she could go to the dining room to eat. She knew clearly that her grandmother didn't treat her as a family member at all. Who knew if she was going to let her eat alone in the kitchen? "Let's not talk about this and that. Let's go." Tianxiao pulled her and ran towards the dining room. The two of them ran into the dining room, only to see that the old man and Madame Zheng were already inside. Mo Chinga hastily let go of Tianxiao's hand, lowered her head and stood behind them. Sure enough, Madame Zheng frowned. How can a girl be so impatient? Mo Chinga didn't dare to answer, but Mo Tianxiao made a funny face. "Grandma, I'm hungry." Madame Zheng glared at her and showed half a smile. "That'll do. Quickly sit down." Mo Tianxiao beamed with joy and sat in her seat. When she turned around and saw that Mo Chinga was still standing there, she waved her hand. "Chinga, come here." Mo Chinga didn't move. There originally wasn't a seat for her here. Madame Zheng coldly glanced at her, then said to the side, "Aunt Lin, add a stool." Aunt Lin responded and moved a stool to Tianxiao's side. Mo Chinga heaved a sigh of relief and cautiously sat down. She then called out in a low voice, "Grandpa, Grandma." The old man nodded and continued to rest with his eyes closed. Madame Zheng turned to the side. "Aunt Lin, where are the others?" Mo Chinga already knew this, so she didn't feel disappointed. She just lowered her head and reminded herself not to care about her grandmother's attitude. Aunt Lin said, "The eldest young master will be here soon. The youngest young master already told Uncle He to look for them." Right after she finished speaking, they heard footsteps coming from outside. The eldest young master and the young madam of the Mo family came in with Mo Tianjun. "Grandpa, Grandma." Without waiting for his parents to greet him, Mo Tianjun already shouted and ran between the two old men. He started chatting happily, amusing the two old men so much that they immediately doted on him like a precious darling. Madame Zheng, who always had a cold expression towards Mo Chinga, now had a kind smile on her face. She kissed Mo Tianjun again and again before telling him to sit down and eat. Mo Chinga didn't have time to think. When Mo Tianjun saw her, he immediately widened his eyes and said, "Why are you here? This is my house." Before she could answer, Mo Tianxiao already said, "Chinga will be in our house from now on. Don't bully her or I'll." She was about to tell her father, but she remembered that her father was here, so she changed her words. "Or I'll make you pay." Mo Tianjun immediately objected. "Hey Mo Tianxiao, I haven't said anything yet, but you already want to make me pay. I'm your older brother, okay? Why are you so intimate with someone else's family?" "What do you mean someone else's family? Chinga is obviously our family. If you don't recognize her, I will. In any case, I've already told you. Just do as you see fit." Mo Tianxiao didn't show weakness at all. Although Tianjun was their family's precious grandson, she was also their precious granddaughter. Although Mo Tianjun was a devil incarnate, he couldn't do anything to his twin sister. Now that he was threatened by her, he saw that the adults didn't intend to do anything, so he could only pretend he didn't hear anything. His expression, however, caused the adults to laugh. Madame Zheng said with a smile, "Let's eat." During this meal, Mo Chinga buried herself in eating. She clearly felt that they were a family. They served food to each other and gossiped, but she couldn't blend in at all. She thought of the small courtyard in the east of the village, the simple dining table, her mother serving her food and listening to her talk about trivial worries. That was her home. Chapter 7. At dawn, Missouri Tienga was awakened by the noise next door. She opened her eyes and stared blankly at the roof for a long time before she remembered this was the ancestral house. The quilt smelled damp. She frowned and got up to put on her clothes. Clothes were easy to wear. She had been wearing clothes since she was 4 years old. She only found it troublesome to braid her hair. No matter how she braided it, she felt it was not as good as her mother's. She tried hard to control her urge to cry. She wiped her eyes, opened the door and went out. In the kitchen next door, Aunt Lin was already making breakfast. Uncle He was chopping firewood in the yard and he did all the rough work in the house. There were also a few servants sweeping the floor and feeding the pigs. Mo Tienga had just finished washing her face when she heard Aunt Lin calling from inside the house. "Hey, come here." She turned her head and looked at Aunt Lin in confusion. Aunt Lin held a shovel in one hand and put the other on her waist. "I'm calling you. Come here and help me light the fire." She glanced around and walked over with her head down. Aunt Lin pushed her to the back of the stove. "Light a big fire outside and a small fire inside." Mo Tienga watched as Aunt Lin turned her head to cut vegetables and ignored her. She bit her lip, sat behind the stove and started to light the fire. Fortunately, breakfast was ready quickly. Aunt Lin boiled a pot of porridge and steamed or fried a few side dishes. She smelled the aroma, and her empty stomach became even hungrier. After breakfast was ready, Aunt Lin saw her coming out of the stove and said, "Go wash your face before eating." Mo Tienga wiped her face and found there was some dust on it. She obediently went to the courtyard to get some water and wiped her face again. She didn't go to the dining room until she felt it was clean. This meal was still the same. She was obviously very hungry, but she couldn't eat anything. After eating hastily, she went to school with Mo Tianxiao. On the way, Mo Tianxiao excitedly said something to her, but she didn't hear it. Until Mo Tianxiao pulled her sleeve and asked worriedly, "Tienga, what's wrong?" Mo Tienga regained her composure and just shook her head. Seeing her like this, Mo Tianxiao didn't speak for a while. The two of them walked in silence for a while before Mo Tianxiao hesitantly said, "Tienga, do you miss your mother?" Mo Tienga was stunned, but she lowered her head and didn't deny it. Mo Tianxiao glanced at Mo Tienga, then held her hand tightly. She said earnestly, "Tienga, I know you're very sad, but your mother is no longer here. It's useless for you to be sad." Although it was a poor comfort, Mo Tienga smiled. "Tianxiao, thank you." Upon seeing Mo Tienga's smile, Mo Tianxiao immediately heaved a sigh of relief. She then continued to speak in high spirits. This time, Mo Tienga agreed with her. When they arrived at the school, they found that the headmaster was already there. They quickly ran to their seats and sat down. Mo Tianxiao was to, and Mo to Mo, and Mo's Mo said, "Mo to Lin to door." Ahem. The old master cleared his throat, and the students immediately quietened down. Zhang. Time, and the students immediately, they heard. "Father," they said. "Tian, master." "Old." The old master's gaze swept through the room. When he saw that Mo Tienga didn't have anything on the table, he said, "Tienga, are your injuries healed?" Master nodded. "You haven't been to school for several days, so you must have missed your homework. Today we'll only check your writing. Go read and come back in the afternoon." "Yes." Master nodded. "You haven't been to school for several days, so you must have missed your homework. Today we'll only check your writing. Go read and come back in the afternoon." "Yes." The old master scanned the crowd once more. "Those who pass the copying test may go and read the book." Mo Tienga put away her books, brushes and ink, bowed to the master, and then entered the library. She hadn't been here for several days, but the library was still the same as before. However, she wasn't in the mood to read today. She took a book from the bookshelf on the east side and opened it. It was still the book she hadn't finished reading that day, Brief Notes on the Celestial Pole. She suddenly remembered the dream and the words spoken by the voice that claimed to be the ancestor of the Mo family. With that thought in mind, she opened the book again. This book was obviously written by a mortal. It only had hearsay about the legends of immortals. She stood on the stool and started to flip through the books on the east shelf. She flipped through the books one by one but found nothing special. Suddenly she found a book called Qing Lian's Notes. She opened the book. The preface of this book was self-written. The author called himself Qing Lian. According to the preface, he was originally a scholar in the Jin country. Because he was full of talent and knowledge, he couldn't be put in an important position, so he wandered the world. Unexpectedly, he obtained an immortal fate and began to practice the law of immortality. Unfortunately, he didn't succeed. When he was more than 200 years old, he felt his lifespan was coming to an end, so he wrote this book and passed it on to his descendants. Mo Chenga immediately put the other books back and took this book to the window to read. At the beginning of the book, Qing Lian told her about his origin. Mo Chenga wasn't interested, so she flipped through the book. Later on, Qing Lian began to talk about his encounter with an immortal fate. As it turned out, when he wandered the world, he once went to a place called Tianmu Mountain. The residents nearby said that this mountain was shrouded in clouds and sometimes had colorful lights, so there must be immortals there. Qing Lian went to Tianmu Mountain alone. This mountain was really magical. The sea of clouds was vast and the mountain rocks were strangely shaped. It was easy to get lost in it. When he got lost, he came to a place that seemed to be the immortal's cave of an immortal. There were strange pictures and characters in this immortal's cave. Seeing how magical it was, he copied it down. Later on, when he left the mountain, he unexpectedly comprehended the law of immortality from it. Later on, Qing Lian practiced the law of immortality, so he felt his ears and eyes were sharp, and his mind was smart. Gradually, immortal aura appeared in his body. He could actually hit things from a distance and was invulnerable. At this point, he was already a bit more powerful than the most powerful martial artists in the world. He happily cultivated the celestial method and did not know the origin of this celestial method. Later, when he accidentally met other people who cultivated the celestial method, he found out that there were actually many people like him in the world. They had their own world called the celestial cultivation world, and people like them were also called cultivators. Mo Chenga recalled that ancestor indeed said the word cultivator. Apparently what this Buddhist Qing Lian said was indeed true. After Qing Lian learned about the cultivation world, he came into contact with other cultivators and slowly learned some common knowledge about cultivation. In the distant past, when the gods were still in the human world, spiritual aura was abundant and spiritual objects were everywhere. There were many cultivators with great divine power, many spiritual beasts with extremely high abilities, and also monsters and devils with strange powers. Cultivators and spiritual beasts often cultivated into immortals, and there were also devil cultivators and monsters who cultivated into devils. But for some reason, a great war suddenly broke out between heaven and earth. Immortals, humans and beasts. Many people died. The world changed, the mountains split, the seas moved, and everything was destroyed. After the distant past came the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages separated the realms of immortals, monsters, and devils, leaving the human world to humans and beasts who hadn't reached the Tao. At that time, the human world still had spiritual aura and environment not inferior to that of the distant past. Sects stood in great numbers, and it was the heyday of humanity. Many cultivation techniques, magic weapons, and so on were created. For more than 100,000 years, the cultivators with great divine power and high-level spiritual beasts disappeared. The spiritual aura began to thin, and many spiritual objects became extinct. Cultivators began to separate themselves from the secular world and no longer lived with mortals. After more than 100,000 years, the cultivators with great divine power disappeared, and the high-level spiritual beasts also disappeared. The spiritual aura began to thin, and many spiritual objects became extinct. Cultivators began to separate themselves from the secular world and no longer lived with mortals. In the current cultivation world, cultivation sects were built in places with abundant spiritual aura, far away from the secular world. Only when they chose disciples would they live among mortals. As for mortals, not everyone could cultivate. Only those with spiritual roots who had spiritual chi in their bodies could cultivate. Among mortals, spiritual roots were 1 in 10,000. Only the descendants of cultivators had a much higher chance of having spiritual roots. The body was divided into two extremes, and spiritual roots belonged to the 5 elements. In other words, one's constitution had yin and yang attributes, and spiritual aura had the 5 elements of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. Ordinary people's constitutions were a mixture of yin and yang, and when they cultivated, they would repel each other. As for spiritual roots, the 5 elements reinforced and restrained each other. If one had spiritual roots that restrained each other, they would cancel each other out. Therefore, the purer one's constitution was, the better, and the fewer spiritual roots one had, the better. In the cultivation world, most people had 3 or 4 spiritual roots. 3 spiritual roots wouldn't be too slow in cultivation, but they usually wouldn't be able to achieve great things. 4 or 5 spiritual roots were poor spiritual roots. Most people would be trapped in the chi refinement realm for their entire lives, and it was also very difficult for them to build their foundation. Qing Lian himself had 4 spiritual roots, but he didn't have any fated encounters, so he couldn't build his foundation. As for those with 3 spiritual roots and above, those with 2 spiritual roots wouldn't be burdened by their natural endowments. In addition, there were mutated spiritual roots that could mutate the 5 elements, and their cultivation speed wasn't inferior to cultivators with single spiritual roots. However, spiritual roots alone weren't omnipotent. Cultivating immortal techniques also involved comprehension and temperament. If one's spiritual roots were slightly bad, but if one's comprehension was excellent, their cultivation speed wouldn't be too slow. As for breaking through to the next realm, it was related to one's temperament. If one's temperament was firm and determined, one wouldn't be trapped by one's mental state during a breakthrough. However, all of this was built on the foundation of spiritual roots. If one's spiritual roots were too bad, it would be useless no matter how good one's comprehension and temperament were. Mo Chenga remembered what the ancestor said. She had a pure Yin constitution and double spiritual roots, so her cultivation speed wasn't any slower than cultivators with single spiritual roots. However, the ancestor said she had 5 element spiritual roots, which were the worst spiritual roots Qing Lian mentioned. Generally, she wouldn't have any great prospects. She was feeling a bit down. Although she hadn't thought too much about what happened that day, she still wasn't too happy to know her spiritual roots weren't good. Chenga, what are you reading? Mo Tianxiao pushed the door open and came in. Mo Chenga closed the book and said, Tianxiao, did you pass? Mo Tianxiao looked happy. Yes, I copied for a whole night yesterday and finally passed with great difficulty. Then what book do you want to read? I'll help you look for it. Mo Tianxiao took the book from Mo Tianxiao and flipped through 2 pages. However, she didn't seem to be interested, so she handed the book back to Mo Tianxiao. You can read it yourself. I'm just casually looking around. And all right. Mo Chenga watched as Mo Tianxiao walked back and forth between the bookshelves. She stared at the book in her hand, hesitated for a moment, then stuffed it into her school bag. Chapter 8. Late at night, the Mo family's mansion fell into silence. Mo Chenga carefully took out the book she smuggled back from her bag. She turned on the oil lamp, spread out a piece of white paper and began to write. She learned to read at the age of 3 and entered school at the age of 6. Although her handwriting wasn't beautiful, it was already quite good. Qing Lian wrote some of his experiences in cultivation at the end of the book. For example, most of the cultivation groups in the Celestial Pole were located in the southern Kunwu mountain range. This mountain range stretched endlessly from west to east, surrounding the entire southern side of the Celestial Pole. It was said that there was a dense forest in the depths of the mountain range, where many demonic beasts roamed. However, only cultivators in the core formation realm or above could pass through the mountain range and reach the southern side. The southern side of the Celestial Pole was a boundless ocean. It was said that there was also land on the other side of the ocean, but Qing Lian had only heard about it briefly, so he only mentioned it briefly. Mo Chenga recalled what her ancestor said. The southern side of the ocean should be Yunzhong, where her ancestor came from. Qing Lian also mentioned that because among mortals, spiritual roots were 1 in 10,000, and the probability of spiritual roots appearing in the descendants of cultivators was much higher, there were cultivation clans. In so-called cultivation clans, the proportion of cultivators could reach 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100, and if the descendants were cultivators themselves, the probability of spiritual roots appearing in their descendants could reach 1 in 10. Therefore, both cultivation groups and cultivation clans encouraged cultivators to get married and have children to continue their inheritance. When cultivators got married, they usually became dual cultivation partners and called each other Dao companions or immortal companions. What greatly surprised Qing Lian was that in the immortal cultivation world, the strong were respected. Unless it was someone who was related by blood or a disciple who had just entered the immortal cultivation world, the seniority would not change. Other people were arranged according to their realms. There was no distinction between age or gender. The lack of distinction between men and women piqued Qing Lian's curiosity the most. Male cultivators would take concubines, but female cultivators would also keep gigolos. However, cultivators raced against time during cultivation, so there weren't many who kept concubines or gigolos. Moreover, in the cultivation world where strength was respected, being a concubine or gigolos was extremely despicable. Unless the master was very powerful or had some unspeakable trouble, very few cultivators were willing to be a concubine or gigolos. However, even so, there were still far fewer high-level female cultivators than male cultivators. First, loose cultivators came from the mortal world. Women in the mortal world rarely left their houses, so it was difficult for them to find opportunities. Thus, there were very few female loose cultivators. Secondly, female cultivators were still women. Their temperaments were emotional, and they were rarely decisive in killing. Therefore, most cultivators above the core formation realm were male cultivators. The contents after that were the items that householder Qing Lian had collected. They were divided into several categories such as pills, magical treasures, cultivation techniques, formations and so on. He didn't have a deep understanding of it, so he only roughly wrote down some well-known examples in the immortal cultivation world. Mo Qianga spent more than 10 days and nights before she finished copying the book. She then quietly returned the original book. However, when he returned, the old master saw him. The old master flipped through the book, and a dazed expression appeared on his face. After a long while, he sighed and said to her, "I didn't believe in the so-called blood connection, but now I have no choice but to believe it. You're interested in this because your father's blood runs through you. Never mind, if one day you can figure it out, you might be able to find your father." What he said shocked Mo Qianga. The old master actually knew about her father's matter? Moreover, her father was also related to cultivation? "Master, what do you think about my father?" The old master put the book back and said, "I'm not very clear. I just knew that your father seemed to have an immortal spell when I was friends with him. I asked him about it, but he didn't admit it, but he didn't deny it either. Later, when your father left, he came to say goodbye and said that it would be dangerous. He asked me to take care of you and your mother. At that time, you weren't even born yet, but he already knew you were a daughter. He must have an immortal spell." He then stroked her head and said, "You don't need to worry too much about this. Immortal spells are hard to find. If you can't find them, just study hard." Seeing the old master shaking his head and leaving, Mo Qianga became excited. "Father has an immortal spell. Does it mean that if I practice that art of Sunu, I'll be like him and I'll be able to find him?" With this thought in mind, she began to seriously recall that dream. She didn't know why, but this dream seemed to be engraved in her mind. Every word said by that female voice, as well as the art of Sunu, was clear in her mind. After school, she returned to the ancestral house. She didn't even have the mood to play with Tianqiao. She shut herself in her small room and recalled the art of Sunu. The ancestor said that the art of Sunu was a cultivation technique that could only be practiced by female cultivators with purine constitution. Cultivating it would yield twice the result with half the effort. However, she had 5 elements spiritual roots. Without a specific cultivation technique, her cultivation would be very slow. Mo Qianga was a bit confused. She had a purine constitution, so cultivating the art of Sunu would be fast. However, she had 5 elements spiritual roots and had to practice a specific cultivation technique. What should she cultivate in the end? After thinking about it, she didn't know what she should cultivate. Right now, she only knew the art of Sunu, so she could only cultivate it first. The first step of cultivation was to draw spiritual aura into her body. She sat cross-legged according to the instructions of the cultivation technique and didn't think about anything else. A child's thoughts were originally very simple. Soon she entered the meditation stage. It was a wonderful feeling. The whole world was empty, and her body seemed to be floating lightly, like a grain of sand in the wind. Gradually, she felt like she was surrounded by water. She felt warm and safe, like she was in her mother's embrace. In this warmth, she felt as if she didn't have the passage of time and she didn't exist. After an unknown amount of time, she was awakened by a sound outside. When she opened her eyes, she discovered that the sky was already bright, but she was still sitting cross-legged in meditation. Did I succeed in the end? If she succeeded, she didn't feel any spiritual aura at all. If she didn't succeed, she didn't feel the passage of time. Moreover, she was very energetic and didn't feel like she didn't sleep at all. She didn't have much time to think because Aunt Lin came and knocked on her door. She knew that Aunt Lin asking her to help was definitely her grandmother's idea. Otherwise, Uncle He and the others wouldn't pretend they didn't see anything. She had no choice but to think about it later. Just as she was about to get out of bed, she almost fell. After sitting for a whole night, her legs were numb. Fortunately, she was still energetic. In the following days, Mo Qianga went to school with Tianqiao and helped Aunt Lin with some chores during the day. At night, she cultivated. Day after day, she still didn't feel the so-called spiritual aura. Every time she finished cultivating, she felt discouraged. However, whenever she remembered that it was related to her father, she would raise her spirits and continue cultivating. However, cultivating still had its benefits. For example, she didn't need to sleep now. Every day, she would be very energetic after cultivating. Her memory was also getting better and better. She only needed to listen to what Master of the Academy taught her once to remember it completely. When she went to the library to read, she didn't need to read too many books. She only needed to read them once to remember them clearly. Moreover, her strength had increased a lot. Now she could carry a bucket of water and didn't feel tired at all when she helped Aunt Lin. However, she still couldn't feel any spiritual aura, so she felt somewhat anxious. Could it be that her cultivation method was wrong? Chapter 9. If she was an ordinary child, she might have stopped cultivating if she couldn't sense spiritual aura. However, Mo Chenga never had the thought of giving up. After her mother died, she lived in the ancestral house and didn't feel any familial love. For a sensitive child like her, every day felt like a year. Living in such an environment made her miss her father, whom she'd never met, more and more. Especially after she learned that her father most likely had an immortal technique, this childish admiration became even stronger. What she didn't know was that the cultivators in the cultivation world all felt the spiritual energy enter their bodies in extremely dense spiritual energy. The individual cultivators in the secular world, on the other hand, often didn't have such detailed records and didn't know what spiritual energy entering their bodies was. They only discovered the appearance of spiritual energy after cultivating for a long time. Her cultivation was lacking, but no one could ask about it. Mo Chenga could only go to the library to flip through the books in the library. Unfortunately, it was already very rare for there to be 2 books related to the cultivation world among mortals. No matter how she flipped through the library, she couldn't find any useful information. Although she couldn't sense spiritual aura, she still meditated and cultivated every night. In her spare time, she carefully recalled the art of Sunu and the knowledge imprinted in her mind by her ancestors, hoping to find some enlightenment. Although there were many things she didn't understand, she firmly believed they would be useful in the future. In the blink of an eye, several months passed. She still couldn't cultivate spiritual aura, but her schoolwork progressed by leaps and bounds. Cultivation improved her memory, and her comprehension ability was completely different from a 7-year-old child's. Later, Master even allowed her to read and write on her own and ask him if she didn't understand anything. Mo Chenga stayed in the library all day long. This made the other children very envious, especially Tianjun and Tianxiao. After learning that she was good at schoolwork, eldest uncle and eldest aunt treated her much better and told Tianjun to ask her if he didn't understand anything. This made Tianjun envious and jealous. He wanted to find an opportunity to bully her, but he didn't have the courage. The happiest one was Tianxiao. She always had a headache about schoolwork, but with Mo Chenga by her side, she had someone to help her with her homework. Only Madame Zheng treated her the same and didn't give her any face, pretending that she didn't exist in the family. However, Mo Chenga didn't care at all. Ever since she learned about the cultivation world and learned that her father was also a cultivator, she only had one thought in her mind: to succeed in her cultivation and leave this place to find her father. Going to school, working, and cultivating were all that mattered to her. Although she felt sad when she thought of her mother sometimes, the desire to find her father overwhelmed everything else. Day after day, he didn't even have much time to play with Tianxiao. Tianxiao was currently being forced by her mother to learn how to be a female worker. Every time she came to play with Tianxiao, Tianxiao would look at her with an envious gaze because no one was forcing her to learn these things. In her heart, however, Mo Chenga thought that Tianxiao was the lucky one. Eldest aunt was so strict with her because she cared about Tianxiao. After another day of fruitless cultivation, Mo Chenga woke up from her meditative state. She was already used to this state. Every time she sat down, her mind would automatically enter meditation. When she woke up, she would feel refreshed. Looking up, the sky was still dark and the moon was bright. The moonlight was bright and white, like a piece of silk without any impurities. It shone through the window onto the bed. She involuntarily reached out, wanting to grasp the moonlight. His palm was filled with rippling moonlight, gentle and bright. She couldn't help but feel a little dazed. She remembered that she had once asked her mother if the moon could be plucked. Her mother smiled and stretched out her hand, holding a handful of moonlight in front of her. She said, "You don't need to take it off. There's beautiful moonlight." Thinking up to this point, Mo Chenga's eyes couldn't help but tear up. It had been almost 3 months. When her mother died, it was autumn. Now it was already winter. She tried hard to stop herself from thinking about her mother. She studied earnestly and cultivated earnestly, but she still missed her mother very much. Her tears kept falling. She wanted to cry again. "Mother." Suddenly, something in the corner of her eyes became brighter and brighter. She forgot to cry and stared blankly at her wrist. It was a string of colored glass beads. Before her mother died, she deliberately found it and said it was her father's. When she found the beads, she didn't know where to put them, so she tried to put them on her wrist. Who would have thought that they would fit on her wrist? Moreover, they were tightly wrapped around her wrist and didn't seem out of place at all. Therefore she just wore them like this. However, she had worn these beads for so long, but she hadn't noticed any abnormalities. She only felt that the beads were very beautiful. Each bead was translucent white without any impurities. Moreover, they were neither hot nor cold. Wearing them made her feel peaceful. At this moment, the beads on her wrist became hotter and hotter, as if they were burning. The light also became brighter and brighter. From the size of a grain of rice, it became bigger and bigger. Little by little, the light spread to her hand, her legs, and finally enveloped her entire body. Chinga only saw a flash of white light before she arrived in a completely dark world. In this world there was no light and nothing, there was only empty space. In this darkness, a glimmer of light suddenly appeared. That light was a dot at first, then it extended into a line. That line grew longer and longer until it suddenly turned into a meteor, fiercely attacking her from afar. She didn't even have time to scream before she was penetrated by that white light. Cold. She originally thought she would feel pain, but she didn't. She only felt cold. That cold aura started from her wrist and slowly flowed along her meridians to her shoulder. Then it flowed down until it reached her dantian. After the light entered her dantian, it wandered around in circles. Gradually, other rays of light flowed in. Strand by strand, they converged into a ball, gradually forming a small ball. That small ball stayed in her dantian. From time to time, rays of light would split from it and travel through her meridians before finally returning to the small ball, forming a cycle. Chinga suddenly opened her eyes. She carefully felt the condition of her body. Sure enough, there was a trace of cold aura constantly traveling between her meridians and then converging into her dantian. Chinga was pleasantly surprised to discover this situation. Spiritual aura. This must be the spiritual aura mentioned in the cultivation technique. She hurriedly sat cross-legged again, preparing to move her whole body according to the cultivation technique. She carefully guided this spiritual aura through certain acupoints to nourish her body and finally returned to her dantian. Chinga didn't stop moving her cultivation technique until this spiritual aura steadily stopped in her dantian. She finally reached the state where spiritual aura entered her body. After she finished moving her spiritual aura, she hurriedly looked at the bead on her wrist. At this moment, this bead no longer emitted a bright white light. It was still the same as before, sparkling and translucent, without the slightest light stuck to her wrist. However, she was sure it wasn't an illusion. This bead must be the magic weapon Father left behind. With that thought in mind, Chinga became even more excited. Father must have known she could cultivate the law of immortality, so he left this magic weapon to help her cultivate. That way she could look for him in the future. However, she still didn't understand what was going on with this bead. It had been so long, but there had never been any abnormalities. Today, however, when her tears fell on it, spiritual aura appeared. Was it because of her tears? Chapter 10. In the following days, Chinga continued to cultivate while curiously trying to find out the secret of the string of glass beads in her hand. This string of beads didn't look expensive, so no one asked her anything when she wore it on her hand. Those who knew that it was her mother's relic, while those who didn't find it strange. In other words, this string of beads was just ordinary glass beads in other people's eyes. Chinga recalled her experience that day and thought it was because of her tears, so she rubbed her eyes and let some tears fall on the beads, but there was no reaction. But apart from that day there was nothing special. She stared at the clear glass beads in her hand and sat there in a daze. These beads felt very cold to the touch, a bit like spiritual aura entering the body. Apart from that, they were very hard. No matter what she hit them with, there wasn't even a crack. Unable to think of a reason, she sat cross-legged again, closed her eyes and began to cultivate. Spiritual aura had already appeared in her body. She slowly learned to control it according to the instructions in the cultivation technique. This was the first time she controlled spiritual aura, so she was very powerless. The spiritual aura roamed around her meridians and dantian, so she couldn't control it at all. She could only guide it to circulate in her body and wait until she slowly adapted to it before continuing to control it. Now, because there was spiritual aura in her body, she could also feel the spiritual aura outside her body. However, the spiritual aura around her was very thin, almost undetectable. Therefore, her next cultivation was still useless. She couldn't absorb even a trace of spiritual aura. Upon realizing this, Mo Chenga stopped cultivating. Since cultivating was useless, she had to find out the secret of this string of beads first. She firmly believed that this was a magic weapon her father left behind, so it definitely wasn't an ordinary object. She just didn't know how to use it. Suddenly she had a flash of inspiration. Since it was a magic weapon, she would use her spiritual aura to test it. With this thought in mind, she continued to cultivate. However, this time she mobilized her spiritual aura and slowly sent it out. This required a lot of effort to control the spiritual aura in her body. When she could barely control her spiritual aura, Mo Chenga was already covered in sweat. However, she didn't plan to rest first. Instead, she began to gather her spiritual aura and sent it out of her body through her meridians. The moment her spiritual aura touched the glass beads, fear suddenly appeared on her face, because she found that her spiritual aura was out of control. As soon as the spiritual aura touched the pearl bracelet, it crazily flowed into the bead. She couldn't control it at all and suddenly felt a sharp pain in her dantian. It turned out that the spiritual aura that she had gathered with great difficulty was completely absorbed by the bead. She turned pale with fright. She didn't have time to think. She was in too much pain and lost consciousness. The coma this time was very short. When Mo Chenga woke up, the sky was still dark. Only a little moonlight shone through the window. She sat up, thought of her spiritual aura, and hurriedly began to meditate. This time she discovered that not only was the spiritual energy in her dantian fine, but there was also a little more, although it was very little. The more she thought about it, the happier she became. Could it be that this bead needed spiritual chi to activate? Then why did the spiritual aura come out when she didn't do anything that night? The more she thought about it, the more confused she became. Until she accidentally found that the bead in her hand was shining under the moonlight. She moved the bead under the moonlight. Sure enough, when the moonlight shone on the bead, it would be a little brighter. Without the moonlight, it would be very dim. Could it be that the spiritual aura came out that night because of the moonlight? With a target in mind, it was easy to verify. Mo Chenga spent several days experimenting and found that the bead would be covered with a layer of hazy light under the moonlight. If she looked carefully, it seemed to be a layer of white gas. After a while, the bead would slowly dim. At that time, if she held the bead, it would produce spiritual aura and enter her body. It seemed that the bead absorbed the moonlight, transformed it into spiritual aura, and passed it to her. She tried not to absorb the moonlight and carefully transferred a very small amount of spiritual aura. Sure enough, before long, the spiritual aura slowly returned to her body, and there was a little more of it. She was very happy to verify this idea. This bead seemed to be able to collect spiritual aura. Now she could use this bead to cultivate without worrying about spiritual aura. After understanding the use of the bead, Mo Chenga's cultivation speed became faster and faster. With an excellent cultivation technique, a source of spiritual aura, and diligent daily cultivation, the spiritual aura in her body kept increasing. There were no more than 3 people who understood the changes in her. One was Aunt Lin. She helped Aunt Lin work every day and it became easier and faster. Another was Tian Xiao. At first she was shorter than Tian Xiao by a head and a lot thinner, but gradually she became as tall as Tian Xiao. The last one was the old master. Sometimes, when she couldn't understand 1 or 2 lines of a cultivation technique, she would ask the old master. The old master would explain it to her word by word, but he never asked her where she got it from. Sometimes, when he looked at her, his gaze contained a lot of complicated emotions. It seemed to be gratification, but it also seemed to be sighing. Just like that, she gradually stopped thinking about her mother and her current situation. She just read, worked, and cultivated day after day. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. In these 3 years, Mo Chenga grew a lot. She was now even a bit taller than Tian Xiao. Her figure was no longer weak, her face was fair, and her facial features were more distinct. She used to be a delicate and pretty child, but because she didn't have enough food and water all year round, she was sallow and emaciated. Now, her complexion was fair, her skin was smooth, and her temperament seemed to be full of vigor. At first glance, she looked extraordinary. In these 3 years, she read all the books in the library, so she didn't need to go to school anymore. As for Tian Xiao, under her aunt's request, she no longer went to school. Instead, she learned how to cook as a female worker every day. Although her aunt didn't teach her at the same time, Mo Chenga became very sensitive because of her cultivation. She learned faster than Tian Xiao even though she watched from the side. Gradually, her aunt told her that she no longer needed to help Aunt Lin work. Instead, she had to accompany Tian Xiao and learn how to cook as a female worker, giving Tianxiao pointers from time to time. These things were only embellishments in her life. Cultivating every night was the most important thing to her. In these 3 years she understood the string of beads better and better, and cultivating became easier and easier. After cultivating for a year, more and more spiritual energy gathered in her dantian. Suddenly there was a strange change. All the meridians in her body seemed to have been opened up. The spiritual energy circulated in her body and settled down in her dantian, no longer drifting erratically. Based on the cultivation technique, she knew she finally entered the threshold of cultivation and reached the first layer of the aura refining realm. In the following 2 years she continued to cultivate without stopping. In these past few days she felt she had reached another boundary and was about to make a breakthrough. Chapter 11. It was a moonlit night. Mo Chenga opened her eyes from her cultivation, sweating profusely. Although she was drenched in sweat, she was actually very happy because she finally broke through and reached the second layer of the aura refining realm. She could now practice some small spells. The art of Sunu was a cultivation technique. In other words, it didn't have any means to deal with enemies. There were only a few spells recorded at the back of the technique. She didn't know if it was added by the Mo family's ancestor who passed the technique to her. These spells recorded the levels of cultivation. Once she reached the second layer of the aura refining realm, she could practice one of the spells called Wind's Breath Technique. Wind's Breath Technique was a spell that used spiritual aura to cause fluctuations and form wind. Once mastered, she could do whatever she wanted and even hurt the enemy without leaving a trace. Mo Chenga wasn't interested in hurting the enemy. However, when her ancestor passed the technique to her, she always reminded her that the cultivation world was filled with dangers. Even if she didn't want to hurt people, she still had to be on guard. Since she wanted to find her father, she definitely had to go to the cultivation world and ask other cultivators. Learning some self-defense techniques was absolutely necessary. However, she felt that since she had just broken through, the spiritual aura in her body was empty, so it wasn't suitable for her to practice immediately. Mo Chenga thought for a while, then went to the kitchen to fetch some water. She washed her body and planned to rest first. In the past few years she rarely slept. She would only feel a little tired after cultivating for 5 or 6 days. She couldn't cultivate during the day, so she raced against time at night. She wouldn't rest if she could. However, she understood the principle of more haste, less speed. For example, now wasn't the right time to cultivate, so she had to rest first. When she woke up, it was already dawn. Mo Chenga opened her eyes. Feeling very relaxed, she finally got up. After folding the quilt, she went to fetch some water to wash her face. Then, she went back to the room and combed her hair in front of a palm-sized mirror. First, she parted her hair into 2 sides, then coiled them into 2 buns. She was no longer the little girl from 3 years ago who didn't even know how to braid her hair. Now she could tie her hair into a bun so that it was smooth and clean. She looked neat and tidy, just like when her mother was still alive. After she finished, she closed the door and went to Qianxiao's room. Now that she didn't need to help Aunt Lin with work, she didn't need to get up so early in the morning. When she got up, she only needed to look for Tianxiao to eat. Her small room did not need to be locked. There was nothing valuable in it anyway. The land deed left behind by her family was managed by her eldest uncle, and her jewelry and other valuables were with her grandmother. She only had about 100 yuan on her, and it was saved up by her eldest aunt who occasionally bought snacks with her. In addition, the Kung Fu manual was in her head, and she always wore the glass bead on her hand. There were only some clothes and bedding left in the room that were neither new nor old, and the material was not very good. She thought that the important things were some brushes, ink, books, and paper, but Aunt Lin and the others were illiterate, so they would not even look at them. Qianxiao's room was located in the courtyard on the 2nd level. Needless to say, the room was more than twice as big as hers. As soon as Mo Chenga walked over, she saw Qianxiao's maidservant coming out with a basin of water. Tianxiao bowed to Mo Chenga and went back to busy herself. This little girl was bought by eldest aunt. Originally, although their family was a local tycoon and had a few servants, they wouldn't buy servants to serve them in their daily lives. However, eldest aunt had high standards and had always raised Tianxiao like a young miss of a noble family. Therefore, when Tianxiao grew up, she bought a little girl to serve her. Tianxiao had indeed woken up the moment Mo Chenga entered the room. She was picking out clothes. When she saw Mo Chenga, she waved at her. "Chenga, help me choose which one to wear." Mo Chenga walked over and saw a pile of clothes on the bed. Tianxiao muttered, "In fact, I think every one of them is good, but if mother doesn't like them, she'll tell me to come back and change them." Alas! His words made Mo Chenga smile. She picked out a sky blue one from the pile and said, "This one." Mo Tianxiao took it and beamed with joy. "I'll definitely listen to you." Mo Chenga shook her head as she looked at the wardrobe full of clothes. Her eldest aunt wholeheartedly wanted to raise Tianxiao as a young lady from a noble family. Unfortunately, Tianxiao had a lively personality, so it would be better to be like her, unrestrained and happy. However, it wasn't Mo Chenga's place to say these words. Even if she did, it would only be interpreted as her jealousy. In the blink of an eye, Tianxiao had already put on her clothes. She smiled at Mo Chenga and said, "Do I look good?" Mo Chenga smiled and nodded. Mo clan had always been famous for its beauties. Tianxiao was also very beautiful. She was only 11 years old, but she already had a good appearance. It was no wonder that her eldest aunt wholeheartedly cultivated her. After Tianxiao finished tidying up, the two of them went to the dining room. Breakfast was already prepared. Grandpa, Grandma, the two of them greeted the old patriarch and Madame Jing together. Madame Jing raised her eyes and saw Tiange standing together with Tianxiao. She couldn't help but wrinkle her brows. She had never concealed her dislike for this granddaughter who wasn't related to her by blood. However, in the past 3 years, her indifference didn't make Tiange shrink back. On the contrary, as she grew up, her bearing became more and more calm. She was no longer as indifferent as when she first came here. Every time Madame Jing saw Mo Tiange standing next to Tianxiao, even though her clothes were much worse than Tianxiao's, Madame Jing always felt unhappy. However, in front of the old patriarch, she couldn't show her displeasure and just nodded indifferently. Father, mother, eldest uncle, eldest aunt. After greeting them, the two of them sat down. Aside from them, Mo Tianjun was already sitting in his own seat. 3 years had passed. He had grown a lot taller and was no longer as naughty as before. It was probably because his 2 younger sisters stopped going to school that he realized his sisters were different from him. Compared to when they were young, he cared more about them. Not only did he no longer bully Mo Tiange, but he also brought Tianxiao some things. "Father, can I go to the market in town?" Mo Tianjun asked his father, then added, "I'll go in the afternoon. I'll go to school in the morning." The eldest young master of the Mo family looked at the old patriarch. Seeing that he was expressionless, he said, "You can only go after you've done your homework." Mo Tianjun clapped his hands happily after getting permission. "I know. I won't delay my homework." He then looked at his mother eagerly. "Mother, give me some money to buy things in the market." Asking for some money to play wasn't a big deal, so the eldest young madam immediately said, "I'll give it to you later, but you can't buy things carelessly." Mo Tianjun nodded repeatedly. Seeing this, Mo Tianxiao hastily said, "Big brother, take me with you. I haven't gone out for a long time." Mo Tianjun wanted to agree, but he didn't dare to. He looked at his parents' expressions and sure enough, his mother said, "You should stay at home and learn to work as a maid. Why would a girl go to the market? There'll be a lot of people there." Mo Tianxiao pouted. "Half a day won't delay anything. I haven't gone out for a long time. I'm bored to death." What she said made sense. The eldest young master thought for a while, then said, "Let Tianxiao go. Tiange and Xiaoshan will go together. Tianjun will take them with him, so there shouldn't be any problems." Mo Tianxiao was so happy that she said repeatedly, "Thank you, father. Father is the best." Mo Chenga sighed inwardly. In fact, she didn't want to go, but she had to accompany the crown prince to study. Chapter 12. In the afternoon, Mo Tianjun came back from the school and excitedly told them to pack their things before setting out. Mo Chenga didn't have much to pack, so she just put the 100 or so coins in her pocket. Mo Tianxiao's little girl, Xiaoshan, packed a lot of things until she finally carried a big basket. Mo Chenga opened the basket out of curiosity. There was a comb, mirror, fan, water bag, snacks, and even a folding stool inside. She was amazed and asked Xiaoshan, what these things were for. Xiaoshan, pointed them out one by one. If the young Mrs. hair is untied, she can use a comb and mirror. If the young Miss is hot, she can use a fan. If the young Miss is thirsty, she can use a water bag. If the young Miss is hungry, she can eat snacks. If the young Miss is tired, she can sit on a stool. Mo Chenga asked, "What if it rains?" Xiaoshan, immediately went to get an umbrella. Mo Chenga was speechless. Whether she was a young miss or not, this little girl had a good style. Tianxiao was really a young miss going on an inspection tour. The three of them finally finished preparing and followed Tianjun out. Of course, Tianjun didn't go alone. There were several boys with him. The nearest town to the Mo family's village was Feiyun Town. It wasn't far, so they arrived in less than an hour. When they arrived in town, Tianxiao, who hadn't walked for a long time, was so tired that she was out of breath and used the small stool. Xiaoshan was fine, but she was also sweating because she carried a big basket. Only Mo Chenga looked as if nothing had happened. Once they entered the town, the boys couldn't hold back and went to play, leaving only the three of them. They waited for Tianxiao to get enough rest before going to the market. Mo Chenga came to Feiyun town with Uncle Awang when she was a child, but she never came out after she went to the ancestral house. Feiyun town wasn't big. They could go back and forth from east to west in an hour. Today was the market and people from all over the area would come to the market. They would sell their local products and exchange them for daily necessities. Tianxiao sat there wiping her sweat while Xiaoshan fanned her and handed her water, looking very busy. Mo Chenga shook her head. She saw a stall selling meat noodles not far away and said, "Let's go there and rest. Let's eat a bowl of meat noodles first." Tianxiao was excited the whole morning and didn't eat much at noon. She nodded. The three of them went to the stall and ordered 3 bowls of meat noodles. Xiaoshan also got a bowl. Knowing that she could sit down and eat with them, she was so happy that tears welled up in her eyes. Seeing this, Mo Chenga couldn't help but sigh. If it weren't for the fact that their family had a small amount of property, it was likely that even after their mother passed away, she would end up in the same situation as little Shan. When first Aunt bought little Shan, she heard that little Shan was originally sold to a wealthy family in the city. But because she made some small mistakes, she was sold out. Presumably little Shan's life in the original owner's family wasn't very good. Tianxiao treated her well, so she was very grateful. Meat noodles were a delicacy in Lianqing. Because there was water everywhere in Lianqing, fish were abundant, so people ate it this way. The fish was finely minced into minced meat, then mixed with flour to form a dough, and then kneaded into noodles. The noodle soup was made from bone broth with plenty of vinegar, onions and ginger. This kind of meat noodles was made with green onions and ginger to remove the fishy smell. Vinegar was added to make it sour and very appetizing. It was chewy and very smooth. Even children liked to eat it. Tianxiao rarely ate this kind of delicacy. After all, the Mo family was a peasant family, so they weren't that particular about food. Aunt Lin only knew how to cook ordinary dishes. The three of them ate a bowl of meat noodles each, but they all felt like they hadn't had enough. Tianxiao wanted to eat more, but Mo Chenga said there were a lot of delicious things in the market. If they were full, they couldn't eat any more, so Tianxiao didn't order more. Upon hearing Mo Chenga's words, little Shan finally realized that she was completely stupid for bringing so many snacks to the market. She was originally a little girl from a wealthy family. People from that kind of family would only bring food they cooked when they went out. How could they eat unknown things from roadside stalls? With the motivation to eat delicious food, Tianxiao also gained strength. The three of them began to stroll slowly in the market. "Young miss, look at this." Little Shan shouted while pointing at a lifelike sugar figurine. Mo Tianxiao hastily moved closer. Sure enough, she saw a small stall selling sugar figurines as well as all kinds of cats and dogs. Tianxiao's gaze was instantly attracted. Occasionally, craftsmen would pass by the village carrying a pole, but they were very rare. Mo Chenga had only seen them a few times. Thus, the three of them chattered about which one was beautiful and which one they should buy. All of a sudden, the hair on Mo Chenga's back stood up. She abruptly turned her head around. Not far from her, a person was looking at her. When he saw her turn around, he smiled and nodded at her. However, he didn't look away as if he was waiting for her to come over. After hesitating for a while, Mo Chenga pulled Tianxiao's sleeve and said, "Tianxiao, I'm going away for a bit. I'll be back in a bit." Where are you going?" "Nothing. Take your time and look around. Wait a bit for me." "Oh." Tianxiao blankly watched as she walked away. Upon seeing her coming, that person turned around and walked in front of her at a moderate pace. He didn't stop until he passed an intersection and entered an alley. That person turned around. He was actually an ordinary-looking youth. At that moment, he revealed a kind smile towards her. He cupped his hands and said, "I'm Liu Shan. May I ask little fellow Daoist's name?" Mo Chenga hastily bowed, using the etiquette used to greet outsiders. She answered, "My surname is Mo." As it turned out, when she turned around, she saw this person standing there with spiritual aura around his body. Obviously, he was also a cultivator. Due to various reasons, she didn't tell anyone about the cultivation technique she obtained. Especially after her mother passed away, she stayed in an unfamiliar home. Her biggest secret was that she only went to look for her father after she succeeded in her cultivation. In the past 3 years she had been cultivating alone in silence. When she suddenly saw a person with spiritual aura around his body, she couldn't help but follow him. The youth named Liu Shan didn't look down on her just because she was young. He said, "So it's fellow Taoist Mo. Being able to meet in the secular world is also fate. I'm an individual cultivator. May I know where your master is? Why are you also lingering in the secular world?" What's an individual cultivator? She seemed to have heard this term before. Liu Shan was stunned. He asked in disbelief, "Fellow Taoist, could it be that you don't have a master or an elder?" Upon hearing his question, Mo Chenga recalled the common knowledge in the cultivation world. Her ancestor and Qing Lian both said that people's minds were hard to predict, so she didn't deny it. "Young master, you don't know, but my father is also a cultivator. It's just that when I was young he left home to look for fated chances. He occasionally sent me letters but he never returned home. That's why I've always been cultivating alone." Oh. Liu Shan actually believed what she said. Cultivation techniques and medicinal pills were hard to come by for cultivators in the secular world. So many people, such as himself, searched everywhere for fated chances. I see. Individual cultivators are cultivators without any cultivation groups or clans. Since fellow Taoist Mo has a father to guide her, it's much better than me painstakingly looking for a fated chance to become an immortal by myself. I can see that fellow Taoist is already in the second layer of the aura refining realm at such a young age. In the future you might be able to enter a cultivation group. It's really enviable. The expression on Liu Shan's face was indeed one of envy. His cultivation level was only in the third layer of the aura refining realm. When he was young he accidentally obtained a fated chance to become an immortal. It took him 10 years of painstaking cultivation to reach his current cultivation level. People like him could be considered lucky. Today he suddenly met a little girl who was also in the second layer of the aura refining realm. How could he not be envious? How could he know that the reason Mo Chenga could reach her current cultivation level was because she possessed a high-grade cultivation technique and a spirit-gathering pearl? With these two advantages she was indeed a bit better than fumbling individual cultivators like them. However, it was only a bit better, nothing more. Due to the limitations of her spiritual roots, it would be very difficult for her to advance her cultivation realm after she reached the middle stage of the aura refining realm. Liu Shan continued, "It's rare for us to meet people who share the same Tao in the secular world. Fellow Taoist Mo, since we're fated to meet, why don't we set a time to discuss the path of cultivation?" Chapter 13. Mo Chenga hesitated for a long time, but in the end she didn't refuse. She was too lonely on the path of cultivation. If she could, she didn't want to stay in that family for another day. Thus, she hid it from everyone and silently cultivated, hoping that one day she would succeed in her cultivation and leave that place to find her father. In the past 3 years no one could talk to her about these things, not even Tianxiao. Tianxiao's life was completely different from hers. Her parents were still alive and she was doted on. In the future she would have a perfect marriage and a happy life. Since the two of them had different paths, what was the point of telling her these words? Therefore the better Tianxiao treated her, the more guilty she felt. In Tianxiao's heart they were sisters and best friends. However, she knew that Tianxiao was just a passerby in her life. One day they would have to go their separate ways. Except for the dream 3 years ago, she only knew about the world of cultivation from books. Her heart was full of curiosity. Now that a cultivator appeared in front of her, she couldn't resist the temptation to learn about that world. After learning that Mo Chenga lived nearby, Liu Shan told her that he would be staying in town for some time. If she had time she could come to the inn to look for him. After the two of them said their goodbyes they went their separate ways. Mo Chenga wasn't in the mood to continue strolling around, so she absent-mindedly accompanied Tianxiao until the sun began to set in the west. Finally Mo Tianjun came looking for them. The group of 7-8 people went home together. When they returned to the ancestral house, Tianxiao excitedly fiddled with the things she bought from the market. Mo Chenga, on the other hand, went back to her own small room and rummaged through the book she copied from the ancestral hall's library. According to the book, householder Qing Lian also said that he accidentally met cultivators in the secular world, and only then did he learn about the existence of the world of cultivators. It was rare for itinerant cultivators in the mortal world to meet other cultivators. Often, if they were fated to meet, they would discuss the Tao with each other, hoping to exchange insights that would be beneficial to their own cultivation. Being able to discuss the path of cultivation with others was extremely attractive to Mo Tiange. For the past 3 years she had been fumbling around on her own. Even if the old master could explain the literal meaning, he couldn't explain the difficulties in cultivation. She had been stumbling around in her cultivation. However, she intended to learn the wind's breath technique first before going to look for Liu Shan. This was because the ancestor and householder Qing Lian both said that it was difficult to fathom a person's mind, so one had to be especially careful when interacting with other cultivators. After learning the wind's breath technique, she also had something to rely on. Thinking of this, she immediately took action. To learn the wind breath technique, one must first be able to control one's spiritual energy flexibly. In order to make better use of the colored glass beads, Mo Tiange had been controlling her spiritual aura for the past 3 years, so this wasn't a problem. Thus, she began to control the spiritual aura to circulate according to the requirements over and over again. Just like that, she practiced for 2 days. She waited until she was sure she could skillfully circulate the spiritual aura in her body according to the requirements before she started to practice the wind's breath technique. He didn't know if it was the annotation of that ancestor, but there were detailed explanations for these small spells. It was best to get used to the circulation of spiritual energy at the beginning of practicing spells before trying to release it into the body. Otherwise, it was easy to hurt oneself. Mo Tiange didn't dare to make any noise and startle other people, so she could only slowly familiarize herself with the circulation of her spiritual aura first. Once she was sure she wouldn't make any mistakes, she carefully practiced. In the beginning he was unable to produce wind. He immersed himself in practicing for several days, but his technique and incantation were always not in place. He could only produce a small breeze, not even enough to blow a piece of paper. It was far from being able to use the wind as a formless blade to hurt people. Mo Tiange was dealt a heavy blow. Her intelligence had always been praised by others. She could speak when she was 1 year old, could read when she was 3 years old, and was always better than others in school. Unfortunately, when it came to learning spells, she didn't know where this intelligence went. But there was no shortcut, so she could only immerse herself in practicing. After practicing for another 3 days, she gradually became proficient in the incantation and technique and could control it freely. Mo Tiange was overjoyed and persisted in practicing. Gradually she could finally control the wind as a blade. She excitedly condensed the wind blade in her palm. With a wave of her hand, the paper in her hand was cut. The smooth cut showed that this cut was clean and neat. A smile appeared on Mo Tiange's face. Although she had been practicing for several years, this was the first time she had the power to hurt people and protect herself. She waved it in the opposite direction. The table didn't move, but the table corner rolled down. But in the next moment, the smile on her face turned into a bitter smile. Her hands loosened and exhaustion appeared on her face. She didn't expect this spell to consume so much spiritual aura. She only used it twice, but her spiritual aura was already exhausted. In the secular world where spiritual aura was thin, it wasn't easy to recover spiritual aura. With this thought in mind, she suddenly remembered there were actually 2 ways to quickly recover spiritual aura in the cultivation world. The first was to use spirit stones. The so-called spirit stones were said to be stones full of spiritual aura and were equivalent to spiritual aura storage tools. The second was to take medicinal pills. However, medicinal pills weren't easy to obtain even in the cultivation world, let alone in the secular world. Speaking of which, she had never seen spirit stones or elixirs. The only things she had that were related to the cultivation world were a cultivation technique imprinted in her mind and a string of glazed beads that could gather spiritual aura. Thinking about this, she became even more interested in seeing Liu Shan. For this reason, she practiced for 2 days until she could use wind's breath skillfully before sneaking out. Sure enough, Liu Shan was in the town's inn. Just as she walked in and before she could ask the waiter, she saw Liu Shan coming down from upstairs. He cupped his hands towards her and said, "Little girl, you finally came." He said to the waiter, "Bring some dishes to my room." Although the waiter was curious, he didn't dare to ask and just obeyed. Mo Tiange was still young, so she naturally wasn't afraid of anything inappropriate. She just followed him inside. Besides, Feiyun town was only a small town with mostly farmers and didn't have many rules. When the dishes were served, the waiter left. Mo Tiange was about to say, "Young Master Li," Liu Shan interrupted her. "Fellow Taoist Mo, you probably haven't had any contact with other cultivators. We cultivators should just call each other fellow Taoist." Mo Tiange thought he was right, so she changed the way she addressed him. "Fellow Taoist Li." Liu Shan smiled. Then he started to talk about some matters related to cultivation. Their cultivation levels were similar, so Mo Chenga could understand what he was talking about. Although Mo Chenga couldn't explain some things, Li Yushan could explain them. At first, Li Yushan talked a lot, but gradually, Mo Chenga could also say a few words. Li Yushan was very enthusiastic towards her and didn't look down on her because of her young age. Mo Chenga originally didn't understand why he was like this, but she gradually understood what he meant. It seemed like when she said that her father was also a cultivator, Li Yushan became more attentive. He thought that since she had this kind of cultivation level at such a young age, it must have been because of the guidance of an elder. Therefore he very humbly asked her for guidance, hoping to learn some secret. Mo Chenga didn't have any secret techniques, but it was true that her cultivation techniques were detailed. If she knew the answers to Li Yushan's questions, she would have answered them one by one. Some of them really solved his doubts, so he became even more enthusiastic towards her. Chapter 14. After discussing for half a day, Li Yushan once again brought up spells. He said, "The cultivation technique I obtained in the past only recorded a few fragmentary spells. One of them was called the fire summoning technique and its power was pretty good." After he finished speaking, he moved his spiritual aura and flicked his finger, conjuring a small flame. With a flick of his finger, the flame suddenly flew away, leaving a finger-wide hole in the wall. Mo Chenga was astonished. It wasn't strange for the flame to have such power. Her wind's breath technique also had such power, and the technique recorded in the book was even more powerful. What was strange about it was that it was fast, and the control was so subtle that it only burned a small hole. Li Yushan smiled contentedly. "I've been practicing this fire summoning technique for 2 or 3 years, so I've already mastered it. I can even resist spirit tools, so I can't show it to you now. Since your cultivation technique is excellent, your spells must be even more powerful, right?" Mo Chenga hesitated for a while, then said cautiously, "It's nothing. My cultivation level is low, so I've only learned a few minor spells. Only the wind's breath technique has a bit of power." Li Yushan looked at her with great interest. "Could you let me see it?" Mo Chenga didn't refuse. She moved her spiritual aura and slashed her palm, splitting the copper candlestick in half. Li Yushan was quite surprised and asked, "What's the most powerful thing your spell can split?" "I don't know." Li Yushan smiled and said, "Since fellow Taoists can use wind spells, does that mean your spiritual roots are excellent?" Mo Chenga was puzzled. "What?" Li Yushan explained, "These spells have attributes, so they're naturally related to spiritual roots. I have 4 spiritual roots, which are metal. Among them, fire spiritual roots are the best, so it's best to practice fire spells. Since fellow Taoists can use wind spells without the help of external objects, your wood spiritual roots must be excellent, or you have mutated wind spiritual roots." Mo Chenga didn't have much knowledge about cultivation, so this explanation was very strange to her. She answered, "I don't know how good my wood spiritual roots are, but they're 5-element spiritual roots and I heard they're not good." Li Yushan was very surprised. "Fellow Taoist, you're so young but you're already in the 2nd layer of the aura refining realm and your spells are so exquisite. Are you actually a 5-element spiritual root?" Mo Chenga didn't understand why he looked so incredulous, but she still answered, "Yes." Upon receiving confirmation, Li Yushan's face was filled with envy. "I presume that fellow Taoist's cultivation technique is excellent and you also have a senior to guide you, so you didn't have to take many detours. May I know what cultivation technique fellow Taoist practices?" This question made Mo Chenga hesitate. The art of Sunu was something only female cultivators with purine constitution could cultivate. The ancestor also said that she mustn't let other people know that she had purine constitution, otherwise she might become someone's human furnace. She still did not know what the human cauldron was, but it was clearly not something good. Li Yushan observed her expression. Seeing her hesitation, he smiled and said, "I was just asking casually. If fellow Taoist doesn't want to tell me, then forget it." Mo Chenga heaved a sigh of relief upon hearing that he no longer asked. The two of them continued to discuss for a while. When Mo Chenga saw that it was getting late, she hastily excused herself and went back. She had gained a lot from this Tao discussion. It was said that Li Yushan was born in Tong-en, the capital city of the Jin nation. When he was young, he accidentally obtained a cultivation technique. Later, he traveled around various countries and met many cultivators. He was very knowledgeable. According to him, although most cultivation sects were located in Kunwu, There were also many cultivation clans and individual cultivators in various countries. In Jin Nation, for example, there were some individual cultivators in Tong'an. They even formed an individual cultivator fellowship and often discussed their experiences with each other. Li Yushan said that his spiritual roots weren't good, and his cultivation technique wasn't good either. After he reached the third layer of the aura refining realm, he couldn't advance, so he traveled everywhere to see if he could find any fated chances. Emo Chenga endured for a long time before she finally stopped herself from asking him about her father. She was still on guard. She was afraid that if this person knew she was alone, he would have bad intentions. Fortunately, Li Yushan thought she really had a cultivation elder. He only discussed the path of cultivation with her and tried his best to explain things she didn't understand. Looking at the sky, she saw that it was getting dark. She hurriedly rushed towards the Mo family's village, but she didn't notice that a figure was following her from afar. Li Yushan was looking at the small village from afar. This village was very ordinary, just like any village in the countryside of Jin Nation. He carefully observed for a long time, but he didn't find any traces of restrictions or formations. He really couldn't tell that there were cultivators here. He saw that the little girl's aptitude wasn't any better than his, but her cultivation level was already in the second layer of the aura refining realm. He was sure that this little girl definitely had something good on her. He had been stuck in the third layer of the aura refining realm for 5 years. He wasn't like this little girl who didn't know anything. It was too difficult for individual cultivators to cultivate to the foundation building realm. Only by joining a cultivation group could they obtain more resources. As for him, his aptitude wasn't good. If he wanted to have any achievements, he had to join a cultivation group. However, with his aptitude, cultivation groups wouldn't accept him. Only if he could cultivate to the foundation building realm would he have a chance. But this was easier said than done. He had been traveling for 5 or 6 years, but he hadn't found any fated chances. This little girl definitely had some secrets. Otherwise, it would be too inconceivable for someone with 5 spiritual roots to cultivate to the second layer of the aura refining realm in 3 years in a secular world with sparse spiritual aura. He himself spent 3 years, but he was only able to enter the first layer. Later, he went to a place with a spirit vein and was able to cultivate to the third layer. He carefully observed this little girl. She didn't have any spirit tools on her. It could be said that with the conditions she said, it was impossible for her to cultivate to the second layer of the aura refining realm. From afar, he saw the little girl walk into the biggest house in the village, so he also walked into the village. At the edge of the village, a middle-aged woman came out to drive some chickens. After thinking for a moment, he walked over. "Greetings, sister-in-law." When the woman raised her head and saw him, she hastily returned his greeting. "Little brother, what's the matter?" Li Yushan said, "I'm just passing by. It's already dark, but I haven't reached the town yet, so I want to stay here for the night." "Oh, I see." The woman sized him up. Seeing that he was polite and didn't seem like a bad person, she happily nodded. "Okay, come in. But our family is poor, so I hope you won't mind." He hastily bowed with his hands clasped in front of him. "Thank you. How could I possibly dare to mind?" The woman shouted into the house, "Boss, someone's here to stay. Quickly come and greet the guest." A man inside responded. Soon after, a sturdy man from the countryside came out. Upon seeing him, he repeatedly greeted him. "Little brother, you want to stay here, right? Quickly come in." "Yes, thanks for the trouble, big brother." Li Yushan clasped his hands before following him inside. This was an ordinary peasant family. There were several dishes and a pair of bowls and chopsticks on the table in the big house. The male owner warmly greeted them. Come, sit. Wife, go and get some rice." The woman outside responded. Soon after, she came back with a bowl of rice. Li Yushan said with embarrassment, "Sorry for troubling you, sister-in-law. I don't know if I've disturbed you." "Ah, it's fine. My wife and child have already eaten. I came back late, so little brother, you can rest assured and eat." Li Yushan smiled and pretended to be hungry. He hastily ate the rice, but inwardly he was already thinking about how to get some information from this family. Chapter 15. At night, a person quietly walked out of a small house in the east of the village. This person was Li Yushan, who had secretly followed Mo Tinga back. He had already learned about the little girl surnamed Mo from this family. Of course, he didn't ask directly. He first pretended to casually ask if the big house belonged to a big family. The man in the house replied that it was the house of the village head. As soon as he heard this, he took the opportunity to inquire about the village. The family didn't have any suspicions and told him everything, including the village head's family members. There were two girls living in that house. One was the village head's eldest granddaughter, and the other was the granddaughter left behind by the daughter's son-in-law. The two girls were about the same age. He observed that the little girl's clothes weren't made of good material and were much worse than the other girl who went to the market with him that day. Moreover, the two girls looked similar, so he was sure that the other girl was the eldest granddaughter. Therefore, the little girl's identity was already obvious. He pretended to sympathize with the little girl and asked about her background. Presumably, no one would gossip about this kind of thing, so this family didn't hide anything. The little girl used to live next door. Before she was born, her father went out for some business and never came back. Her mother also passed away 3 years ago, so the helpless little girl was taken back to her grandfather's house. He then asked about the little girl's father. Sure enough, he heard something he was interested in. When the man talked about that man, he said he was very knowledgeable. Not only was he skilled in medicine, but he also practiced martial arts. Unfortunately, he didn't know where he went and didn't come back today. Liu Shan was sure that the little girl was right. Her father must be a cultivator, which was why he was so mysterious. However, he didn't know what his cultivation level was. However, he was also puzzled. Why did this cultivator stay in this ordinary village and marry a mortal woman? Cultivators didn't care about mortals. They would only marry women who were also cultivators as dual cultivation partners, which would be helpful to their cultivation. As for mortal women, they would at most take them as concubines. How could they marry and have children with them? Moreover, the woman he married was born with a disease, which was even more puzzling. The methods of cultivators were like the methods of immortals to mortals, so it was very easy for them to cure mortals. Because of this, he specifically asked about the woman. Sure enough, her husband had tried his best to alleviate her illness during those years. He sensitively felt that there must be a secret on this woman's body. Perhaps this secret was still with her daughter. With this thought, he sneaked out under the cover of the night and entered the courtyard next door. It was obvious that no one had lived in this house for a long time. The yard was empty, and when the door was pushed open, one could smell the musty smell of wood. There was only some furniture in the house. It was empty and there were no daily necessities. He looked through it carefully but did not find anything out of the ordinary. Even if there was something there, it would have been taken away by someone. He was extremely disappointed. He left the house and walked towards the largest house. Before he got close, he could see a faint spirit light coming from the house, which meant that someone was cultivating. With such a clear spiritual light, it could be seen that this little girl did not use a defensive formation. Although mortals could not see it, cultivators could see it clearly. He couldn't help but sigh. This little girl was so young, yet she was able to endure the boredom of cultivation. She was still cultivating so late at night. It seemed like it wasn't just luck that she had such a cultivation. After quietly observing for a while, his brows slowly wrinkled. This was clearly wrong. When cultivators cultivated, the spiritual light they emitted was related to the spiritual aura they absorbed, and the type of spiritual aura they absorbed was determined by the cultivation technique they practiced. Therefore, if they practiced a metal element cultivation technique, the spiritual light would be a faint golden color. If they practiced a fire element cultivation technique, the spiritual light would be red. However, the spiritual light in front of him did not have any color. In other words, the cultivation technique this little girl practiced didn't have any attribute. Any cultivation technique without any attribute of the 5 elements wasn't a simple entry-level cultivation technique. It either had special functions or was extremely powerful. He became excited. A good cultivation technique indicated extremely fast progress, and it might even be possible for him to build his foundation. He originally thought this little girl's cultivation technique was only good, but he didn't expect it to actually not be an ordinary entry-level cultivation technique. As he thought about this, greed rose in his heart. If she had this cultivation technique, it was almost dawn, so she stopped cultivating for the day. The cultivation insights she heard from Liu Shan were indeed very useful. Many things she couldn't figure out in the past were easily solved. She gained a lot from this night's cultivation. She went out to freshen up in a good mood. Even Aunt Lin's dark expression didn't affect her good mood. After dinner, she told Tian Xiao that she was going to go to town again. Because her cultivation yesterday was very fruitful, she planned to see Liu Shan again today to talk about cultivation. However, just as she arrived in town, she saw Liu Shan walking out of the inn with his luggage on his back. "Fellow Taoist Li, are you leaving?" Liu Shan smiled when he saw her. "Yes. I've stayed here for half a month, so I should continue on my way." "Fellow Taoist Mo, why did you come looking for me?" Mo Chinga said, "Yesterday when we talked about our experiences, some things were suddenly enlightened, so I came to disturb you again today. But since fellow Taoist wants to leave, I won't trouble you." "Not at all." Liu Shan smiled. "If fellow Taoist wants to talk about our experiences, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Fellow Taoist, why don't we find a place to talk?" Mo Chinga thought about it and nodded. "Okay." Liu Shan led her to the bridge at the town entrance and sat down at a tea stall next to the bridge. Once they sat down, Liu Shan went straight to the point. "Fellow Taoist, did your cultivation yesterday go smoothly?" Mo Chinga nodded. "I have to thank you. I've always wondered why my meridians are sometimes difficult to pass through. You told me to use spiritual aura to nourish them, so I circulated my meridians yesterday. Sure enough, I feel much better now." Liu Shan shook his hand with a smile. "Everyone in the cultivation world knows about this, but it's not my credit. Besides, I also benefited a lot from fellow Taoists' advice. The method of practicing spiritual aura circulation before cultivating spells will be very useful for me when I study spells in the future." He then asked with interest, "Fellow Taoist Mo, your father has been gone for a long time. How did he guide you?" Mo Chinga paused for a moment, then said cautiously, "If there's anything I don't understand, I'll write to my father and ask him." Liu Shan made an "oh" sound, but what he was thinking was that the villager clearly said her father left and never came back. There was basically no news from him. It seemed this little girl was also on guard against him. However, she was still young, so it was too easy to fool her. With this thought in mind, he asked again, "What about your other relatives? It's really rare to see cultivators like fellow Taoist who hide their identity and live among mortals." Mo Chinga lowered her head and said, "My mother passed away several years ago due to an illness. Now she lives with other elders." Liu Shan hurriedly apologized upon seeing her depressed mood. "I'm sorry for bringing up your sad past. But since your father is also a cultivator, why didn't he cure your mother? Mortals' illnesses are really easy for us." Mo Chinga still shook her head. "My mother's illness can't be cured. My father said it's a problem with my constitution. He can't do anything about it." "A problem with her constitution?" Liu Shan's eyes lit up. The so-called problem with one's constitution was that there was a problem with the innate yin and yang of the 5 elements. There were several reasons why a mortal couldn't survive. The first reason was that the 5 elements were in disorder. The second reason was that the yin and yang were not in harmony. The third reason was that the mortal was contaminated with ghost aura or devil aura that shouldn't exist. Although the 5 elements in disorder couldn't be cured, it could prolong one's life. The ghost aura or devil aura in the body could be expelled, but the yin and yang were not in harmony. As for the yin and yang were not in harmony, it meant that the mortal had an innate pure yang or pure yin body. Thinking up to this point, he suddenly became excited. Women with pure yang bodies or men with pure yin bodies would generally die prematurely soon after they were born. Only women with pure yin bodies could live long enough to give birth to offspring. If that was the case, then all his doubts would be easily solved. The reason why that cultivator stayed behind and married a mortal woman was because she had a pure yin body. Although she didn't have spiritual roots, she was extremely beneficial to the cultivator. Moreover, this kind of constitution could be inherited, and the probability of the cultivator's offspring having spiritual roots was very high. He lowered his eyes to conceal his excitement because he realized that this little girl was very likely one of the lucky ones. A woman with a pure yin body and spiritual roots. It was no wonder that she could cultivate in this secular world even though she only relied on her 5-element spiritual roots. He couldn't help but recall the news he heard in Kunwu. A female cultivator with a pure yin body was hard to find, and she would be the best human furnace. Chapter 16. Mo Chinga felt more and more dizzy. What's going on? She couldn't figure it out. She only felt Liu Shan swaying in front of her, and his smile became more and more strange. Finally, she tilted her head and fell down. Liu Shan, who was sitting across from her, smiled mysteriously. After a long time, Mo Chinga woke up. She felt a bit strange. The swaying roof seemed to be moving forward. Where am I? She turned her head to look around and almost jumped up. She was in a carriage and Liu Shan was sitting next to her. His eyes were filled with greed, ruthlessness, and intoxication. His gaze made Mo Chinga's hair stand on end. She was startled. What's going on? Liu Shan smiled. However, this smile didn't have the kindness he usually showed when he talked to her. Instead, it was cold. Fellow Taoist Mo? He fiddled with something that looked like a feng shui compass and looked at her like a cat looking at a mouse. Fellow Taoist, it turns out you have a purine constitution. No wonder you have such a high cultivation level in this secular world. You really make people with poor aptitudes like me envious. Mo Chinga was so shocked that she couldn't even speak. Do you want to ask me how I know? Liu Shan asked. Seeing her panicked expression, he smiled and said, Fellow Taoist, Mo is talented and intelligent, far surpassing your peers. Unfortunately, you're too young and inexperienced. Do you remember what you said to me? Mo Chinga didn't understand. Liu Shan sneered and reminded her, You said your mother couldn't be saved because of her constitution, right? Mo Chinga nodded. He continued, Fellow Taoist Mo, you must not know that there's only one kind of constitution we can't save for mortals, the imbalance of yin and yang. As the saying goes, solitary yin doesn't grow and solitary yang doesn't give birth. For mortals, both men and women have yin and yang in their bodies. It's just that men have more yang and less yin and women have more yin and less yang. If a mortal only has one of them, he won't live long. However, men with pure yin constitution and women with pure yang constitution will die prematurely. Since your mother lived until she gave birth to you, she must have a pure yin constitution. Mo Chinga stared at him in horror. She thought that she was already careful enough, but she didn't expect that just one sentence would let others know the truth. Liu Shan continued, The pure yin body has always been hereditary. Of course, the probability is not high. Moreover, people often die before they can give birth to their children. I'm not sure if you've inherited it, but it's very likely that you've made such progress in the secular world with your aptitude of 5 spiritual roots. However, I've already confirmed it now. He raised the disc in his hand. The spirit disc has determined that you indeed have a pure yin body. Mo Chinga stared at the plate in his hand, then glared at him. Then what do you want? Liu Shan raised his head and laughed. His gaze on Mo Chinga made her hair stand on end. Fellow Taoist Mo, you must know what a pure yin constitution represents, right? Their cultivation speed is much faster than that of ordinary people. Furthermore, they are extremely beneficial to their dual cultivation partners. If they were to be used as cauldrons, they would be the best cauldrons. Seeing this terrifying expression, Mo Chinga was so frightened that she retreated. However, she suddenly remembered that she knew magic, so she raised her palm, wanting to use the wind's breath technique. However, in the next moment, she turned pale with fright again. She couldn't circulate her spiritual aura. Liu Shan sneered and said, You don't need to try. The pollen I gave you is called fragrant jade flower. This kind of pollen can temporarily seal your spiritual aura. You. Mo Chinga glowered at him. If my father finds out, he definitely won't let you off. Your father? Liu Shan looked at her contemptuously. Do you think I didn't ask around? Everyone said your father left before you were born and never came back. There was no news of him at all. I'm afraid you used the cultivation technique your father left behind to cultivate carelessly, right? That's why you don't even know some common sense. His guess wasn't wrong, but he never would have guessed that Mo Chinga's cultivation technique came from her ancestors' legacy. Once he said that, Mo Chinga was already in complete despair. She wanted to leave the Mo family, but she didn't want to leave like this. She really regretted talking so much to a strange cultivator. Her ancestors said people's hearts were hard to predict on the path of cultivation. It was indeed true, but it was too late for her to regret it now. Liu Shan's expression softened. He lovingly stroked her head and said, You don't need to be so afraid. I'll have to wait until you grow up to be a human furnace. Besides, other female cultivators might not be able to improve their cultivation after becoming a human furnace, but you don't need to worry. With your physique, it's very easy for you to replenish your spiritual aura. Besides, it'll only be useful to me if your cultivation level improves, right? His tone wasn't comforting at all, it was merely threatening. If she obediently listened to him, he would give her a good life. Mo Chinga's face turned pale again. In the end, she couldn't hold back her fear and asked in a low voice, Human furnace? What's a human furnace? Do you want to absorb my spiritual aura? Liu Shan was stunned, but he soon burst into laughter. He shook his head and said, How could I think such a young child would understand? But it doesn't matter. You'll understand when the time comes. As he spoke, he reached out and lifted Mo Chinga's head. After scrutinizing her for a long time, he felt a bit more satisfied. He thought in his heart, This little girl looks pretty good. Presumably she'll also be a beauty when she grows up. That's even better. Mo Chinga couldn't help but tremble under his gaze, which was filled with evil intent. Without spiritual aura, she would only be a 10-year-old child. Liu Shan, on the other hand, was very appreciative of her current expression. He said to himself, "With you, there's always hope for me to build my foundation. In another 5 or 6 years, before I turn 40, I'll definitely be able to cultivate to the 10th layer of the aura refining realm. At that time, I'll be able to join a cultivation group." At this point he couldn't help but show an intoxicated expression. He was born in an ordinary family in Tong'an City. When he was a child he accidentally saw 2 cultivators fighting and picked up a cultivation technique manual. Just like that he began his cultivation path. In the beginning he was ignorant about it. It wasn't until a year later when he unexpectedly sensed spiritual aura that he realized this was a cultivation technique that could help him cultivate to become an immortal. Later when he learned about the existence of the cultivation world, he left his home and went to Kunwu. There, he witnessed the various methods of cultivators and finally understood the existence of such a vast world. He couldn't continue to be immortal, so he traveled everywhere, hoping to run into a fated chance to enter a cultivation group. Then he could build his foundation and form his gold core. Unfortunately, in the past few years he was still a down-and-out individual cultivator with poor spiritual roots. No cultivation group was willing to accept him, and he never ran into a fated chance. But now things were different. His eyes shone brightly. As long as this little girl grew up and could be used as a human furnace, he would be able to practice dual cultivation and harvest her body. Ha ha ha. Amidst his wild laughter, Emo Chenga shrank into a corner. She wanted to ask him where he was going, but in the end she didn't dare to ask. Chapter 17. Emo Chenga didn't know how long the carriage had been moving. She curled up in a corner in a daze, feeling that every moment was unbearable. Li Yushan didn't care about her and continued to meditate and cultivate. The carriage suddenly stopped and the coachman's voice came from outside. "Master Immortal, we've arrived at Lianqing." Li Yushan opened his eyes and grunted. He then dragged Emo Chenga out of the carriage. Emo Chenga dodged his outstretched hand, but it was useless. She was still dragged out of the carriage. Lianqing was the big city where the Emo family's village was located. Many people in the Emo family's village had never been to Lianqing in their entire lives. Emo Chenga was in no mood to see what Lianqing looked like. She was just being led into an inn by Li Yushan in a daze. After Li Yushan asked for a room, he carried her into the room, threw her into a corner, and ordered a bunch of dishes. Before she left in the morning, Emo Chenga told Tianxiao about it. However, even if they found out she was kidnapped, they wouldn't chase after her. Besides, the person who kidnapped her wasn't an ordinary person. In front of cultivators, mortals' lives were too fragile. Since she couldn't count on others, she could only rely on herself. First of all, her spiritual aura was restricted, but it wouldn't be forever. Li Yushan also said she would only be useful to him if her cultivation level improved. Therefore he had to let her cultivate so she would have a chance. Second, he said it would take at least a few years before she would be useful to him. In that case she wouldn't be in danger for the next few years. With that in mind she made up her mind. Surviving was the most important thing. As long as she was alive she would have a few years to escape. Before long the inn owner brought them some food. Li Yushan picked up his chopsticks and said, "If you want to eat, then come and eat. If you don't, I won't care if you get hungry." She was indeed hungry, but the thought of eating at the same table as this person made her feel disgusted. She struggled for a while but eventually stood up and slowly walked over. The food was very rich. Although Li Yushan was a low-level cultivator, he was an immortal in the eyes of mortals, so his life was naturally good. Seeing Emo Chenga lowering her head and eating a few mouthfuls of rice, Li Yushan smiled with satisfaction and drank alone with relish. Since Emo Chenga was willing to yield, he had nothing to worry about. What he needed to do next was to find a safe way to control her and raise her for 5 or 6 years. As for now, he wasn't in the mood to travel the world. He just needed to find a place to slowly cultivate. When it came to cultivating, it was naturally better to go to Kunwu. This spirit vein ran across the southern part of the celestial pole and stretched on endlessly, so one could always find a place to cultivate. As for other places, firstly, there weren't such large spirit veins, and secondly, spirit veins were generally occupied by other people. Having made up his mind, he once again looked at Emo Chenga. Seeing that she was obediently eating and didn't even dare to make a sound, he felt even more relieved. Once they finished eating, Li Yushan prepared to sit in meditation and cultivate again. However, when he looked at Emo Chenga he felt a bit worried. He rummaged around his body and took out a few plates that looked very similar to a spirit disc. He then took out a few small flags and placed them in the 4 corners of the room. Emo Chenga had never seen these things before, so she looked at them curiously. In a good mood, Liu Shan explained, "This is a spirit sealing formation. Not only can it block spiritual energy, but it also has a defensive function. Don't even think about escaping." Formation? It was recorded in Qing Lian's book that the Tao of formations had long been passed down to the mortal world. Mortals used the superficial knowledge of formations passed down from the cultivation world to arrange troops and formations. The formations of the cultivation world definitely didn't have this little bit of power. The formations of the distant past era had the power to destroy the heavens and split the earth. Even now, there were still some extremely powerful formations. The great mountain-protecting formations of some cultivation groups were even the foundation of their establishment. However, now wasn't the time for Mo Chenga to seek knowledge. Liu Shan threw a quilt to her and rummaged through his bag for a long time. Finally, he picked up a book and threw it to her. He said, "Be good and stay here." Right after he said that, he went back to cultivating, minding his own business. Mo Chenga stared at him, lowered her head, spread the quilt, and started to flip through the book. This book was called Collection of Spiritual Objects. She opened it to take a look. Sure enough, it was an illustrated handbook with all kinds of spiritual plants and objects recorded on it. There were even pictures attached to it. In fact, these were some of the most common things in the cultivation world. In Kunwu, only individual cultivators from the secular world needed this book. However, Mo Chenga was very curious about it. She had never come into contact with things in the cultivation world, and Qing Lian was only an ordinary individual cultivator. What he wrote was only a general overview. It didn't have such detailed records of the origin and function of spiritual plants and objects, let alone pictures. With this book, Mo Chenga felt that her night wouldn't be too bad. While reading, she paid attention to Liu Shan's condition from time to time. Gradually, spiritual aura gathered in the room. This spiritual aura was very thin, so thin that Mo Chenga couldn't feel it. She couldn't help but cast her gaze towards Liu Shan, who was lying on the bed. Liu Shan was breathing, and the spiritual aura slowly gathered around his body. As Mo Chenga watched, she quietly moved her right hand to her left wrist and pulled out the string of colored glass beads. Then, she saw the beads absorb the spiritual aura in the room at a speed visible to the naked eye. Before long, all the spiritual aura in the room was sucked dry. Liu Shan frowned. A puzzled expression appeared on his face. After meditating for a while, he still couldn't feel any spiritual aura, so he finally opened his eyes and stopped cultivating. Mo Chenga hastily withdrew her gaze. However, Liu Shan had already noticed her, so he immediately fixed his gaze on her. After watching for a while, Liu Shan raised his chin towards her and said, "Come here." Mo Chenga didn't move. Liu Shan was furious. He walked over and grabbed her, shouting, "Was it you who did this?" Mo Chenga's complexion was deathly pale. She just shook her head repeatedly. Liu Shan stared at her for a long time as if he was looking for something. However, even after staring for a long time, he couldn't find anything unusual about her. Of course, she didn't have a spirit tool. Even Liu Shan himself only had a small flying sword, and it was even a spirit tool of the lowest grade. Normally he wouldn't take it out to use. Besides, spirit tools couldn't possibly escape his eyes. As for cultivation techniques, his spiritual aura had long been sealed by him, so it was impossible for him to use spells. However, it was a fact that the spiritual aura in the room had suddenly disappeared. Liu Shan couldn't figure it out no matter how hard he thought about it. He loosened his grip and threw her back with a bewildered expression. Mo Chenga was thrown back by him. Her collar was grabbed and her throat was squeezed uncomfortably. Now that she was free, she coughed repeatedly. Liu Shan glanced at her in disgust and sat back down. However, he didn't continue cultivating. Instead, he sized her up from time to time. Mo Chenga kept her head lowered. Her tears fell one by one onto her clothes. Liu Shan frowned when he saw her like this, but he no longer doubted her. She was just a little girl. Her cultivation level was lower than his, and her spiritual aura was sealed. He didn't believe she could play any tricks in front of him. He didn't notice that Mo Chenga had subconsciously grabbed her sleeves. Originally, she only pretended to cry so that Liu Shan wouldn't doubt her anymore. However, when she thought about the current situation, she really cried. She hadn't cried since her mother died because her mother didn't want her to feel sad. Also, she knew there was no one who loved her and she could only rely on herself. However, the more she thought about it, the more terrified she became. She didn't know what this person wanted to do to her, but she was sure it wasn't something good. If she couldn't escape, would she become a tool for the rest of her life? She wouldn't be able to cultivate properly, and she wouldn't be able to find her father. The terrifying scene she imagined made her face turn pale. Chapter 18. After staying in Lianqing City for only one day, Liu Shan took Mo Qingge on their way again. Mo Qingge didn't know where he was going. She only saw him holding a piece of jade about 2 fingers wide and placing it on his forehead, closing his eyes and meditating. She was curious but she didn't dare to ask. When Liu Shan put away the thing, he saw her expression and said with a smile, "You've never seen this before, right? This is called a jade slip. Like bamboo slips, it's used by cultivators to record things. Come, I'll give it to you." Perhaps because he was in a good mood, he didn't show her any displeasure and even greeted her with a smile. Liu Shan placed the thing on her forehead and said, "Try it. Send a strand of your divine sense into the jade slip. This won't use spiritual power." Mo Qingge was still very unfamiliar with the use of divine sense. Usually, she only used it to sense if anyone was approaching her hut, and she was also on guard against Liu Shan. However, she didn't dare to say no to Liu Shan, so she could only try to send a strand of her divine sense. As soon as her divine sense came into contact with the jade, it was instantly submerged. Then, a model of a mountain appeared in her mind. Rather than saying it was a mountain, it was more like a mountain range. It was too long. There were a few scattered marks on it. Some were marked with cultivation groups, some with market squares, and so on. This was an eye-opener for her. Liu Shan put away the jade slip and said, "This is Kunwu Mountain. The spirit veins in the celestial pole are different from those in other places." It said that in other places spirit veins are scattered everywhere, but in the celestial pole, the largest and most important spirit vein is Kunwu Mountain Range. Other spirit veins are scattered and can't be compared. Mo Qingge had some understanding of this. Kunwu Mountain was huge, so individual cultivators mostly went there to cultivate. Could it be that Liu Shan also wanted to go to Kunwu? Liu Shan said, "For individual cultivators like us, Kunwu is the best. With large spirit veins, some places don't have cultivation groups or cultivation clans. Cultivating on spirit veins is much better than cultivating in the secular world." Then he said to her gently, "You see, it's better to follow me than stay in your secular world home. Cultivating there will be much faster than cultivating alone." Mo Qingge didn't know what he was planning. He was no longer threatening her but tempting her. Perhaps he thought it would be more convenient for her to listen to him in the future? How could she have known that Liu Shan would do such a thing? She only thought that she was still young and definitely didn't have any ideas. If he used both kindness and power, perhaps she would gradually listen to him. Especially yesterday when he saw that Mo Qingge didn't have an extreme reaction, he felt that it was very likely. Since he was going to keep her by his side for a long time, an obedient cauldron was better than a disobedient one. Now that he saw that although she was gloomy, she didn't have any other reaction, his mood became even better. He said, "When we arrive in Kunwu, we'll find a place to properly cultivate. If you're obedient, I'll take you to try to enter a cultivation group. If you can enter a cultivation group, your future will be bright." A fascinated expression appeared on his face, but when he turned around and saw that Mo Qingge was still in a daze, he couldn't help but wrinkle his brows. He felt that he was talking about benefits to a child, so how could she understand? He couldn't help but feel a little angry. With a snort, he turned his head and ignored her again. However, Mo Qingge was more than happy to see that happen. Suppressing her anger towards Liu Shan was already very difficult for her. As the carriage continued to move forward, Liu Shan once again began to meditate and cultivate. Since the space was so small, Mo Qingge didn't dare to take out the colored glass bead to play tricks again. After thinking for a while, she finally took out the book Liu Shan gave her yesterday and continued to read. This book obviously wasn't made of paper. Instead, it seemed to be made of the skin of some kind of animal. It was soft to the touch and didn't make any sound when she flipped through it. Presumably, the things in the cultivation world must be very different from those in the secular world. Even if Mo Qingge didn't use jade slips, this paper wasn't ordinary paper. She took another look at Liu Shan. Seeing that he wasn't paying attention to her, she finally felt relieved and slowly turned the pages of the book. In fact, some spiritual plants could also be found in the secular world, such as ginseng and lingji mushroom. It was just that they needed to be very old to be useful. Moreover, in the cultivation world, they could only be regarded as low-grade spiritual plants. As she flipped through the pages, her hand stopped for a moment. Fragrant jade flower could be used after 10 years of growth. It was one of the raw materials of bewitching powder. Its pollen could slow down the movement of spiritual aura. Low-level cultivators would be temporarily unable to move their spiritual aura. She raised her head to look at Liu Shan. Upon seeing that he was cultivating with his eyes closed, she carefully looked through the book again. There were pictures and explanations, but there was no solution. She hesitated for a long time before she continued to flip through the book. Since there were introductions to the functions, maybe she could find something that could relieve this state. With this thought in mind, she carefully flipped through the pages one by one. All of a sudden she felt a fluctuation of spiritual aura. This fluctuation wasn't because someone was cultivating next to her. Rather, it felt like spiritual aura was colliding with a large area. While she was puzzled, Liu Shan opened his eyes and revealed an excited expression. Someone's fighting here. Emo Chenga was a bit surprised. She hadn't left her home for long, but she already encountered cultivators. Moreover, they were fighting. But why was Liu Shan so excited? Was he not afraid of getting involved? Just as she was thinking about this, she heard him shout for the carriage to stop. Then he ordered the coachman to wait here and pulled Emo Chenga out of the carriage. Follow me carefully. Right now you can't move your spiritual aura, so only I can protect you. Do you understand? He didn't wait for her to answer and slowly walked towards the source of the spiritual aura fluctuation. Ever since she confirmed she had no ability to resist, Emo Chenga always looked scared and didn't dare to speak when faced with his threats and temptations. Liu Shan also gradually adapted to her silence. In any case, it was fine as long as she was obedient to him. The two of them, one in front and one behind, didn't walk far before they heard a clear sound. Sometimes it was muffled, as if two spiritual auras were colliding with each other. Sometimes it was sharp, as if weapons were colliding. All of a sudden, a bright light streaked across the sky. It was a very bright flame. Only then did Emo Chenga see two people floating in the sky. Both of them were wearing Taoist robes, but their styles were very different. One was wearing green while the other was wearing blue. That flame was emitted by the man in black. Under the control of the man in black, that flame rushed towards the man in blue. The man in blue, however, held a sword horizontally in his hand and blocked the flame. Liu Shan's expression changed. He turned around and walked away. Let's go. This isn't something we can meddle in. Emo Chenga roughly understood that these two people's cultivation levels were very high, but she couldn't understand why Liu Shan was so excited at first. The two people flying in the sky seemed to have discovered their existence. The man in black let out a cold humph and waved his hand, sending a flame towards them. Liu Shan hastily pulled her and ran like crazy. Emo Chenga was also startled. She hastily ran after them, not daring to look back. That flame suddenly caught up to them, but it deviated and hit the spot next to them. Liu Shan was drenched in cold sweat. He didn't dare to stay and hastily slipped away. The two of them ran for a while and finally returned to the carriage. Liu Shan ordered the coachman to hurry up. He still looked frightened. After a long time he calmed down and said, "Do you know the cultivation levels of those two people just now?" Emo Chenga shook her head. He snorted and said, "They were experts in the 8th layer of the aura refining realm. They could kill us as easily as blowing off dust. If they weren't fighting each other and didn't care about us, I'm afraid we would have already been burned to ashes." Once he finished speaking, a yearning expression appeared on his face. "If I can cultivate to that realm, I'll have a chance to join a cultivation group." He became nervous again and no longer paid any attention to Emo Chenga. He sat in meditation and adjusted his breath, occasionally looking back. At that moment, Emo Chenga was thinking how good it would be if she had that kind of cultivation level. At that time she could trample Liu Shan under her feet. She secretly clenched her fists. "I must endure it. One day I'll cultivate to that realm. At that time." Chapter 19. "Here, let's go after you finish eating." Two dry steamed buns were thrown at her. Emo Chenga looked up and caught them. They were in a desolate suburb. It had been a day since they left Lianqing City. On the road they encountered two cultivators fighting. Liu Shan was so frightened that he hurriedly ordered the coachman to hurry up. After half a day passed and no one was chasing them, he finally felt relieved. The steamed buns were dry. Emo Chenga couldn't swallow them after taking 2 bites. She looked up and saw that although Liu Shan was also eating a dry steamed bun, he also had roast chicken, beef and other cooked food. Liu Shan noticed her gaze and picked up a piece of chicken. "Do you want to eat?" Emo Chenga shook her head and said, "I want to drink water." This was the first time she spoke in the past few days. Liu Shan was surprised and annoyed at the same time. He didn't believe such a big child wouldn't want to eat delicious food. She must not want to beg him. This also meant that although this little girl was young, she was very stubborn. It would be difficult to make her obedient. When he regained his senses, he saw that Emo Chenga didn't seem to want to give him water. She just sat there and slowly gnawed on the dry steamed bun. Although he was annoyed, he didn't really want her to die of thirst. He took out a water bag from his bag and threw it to her. "This is yours. If you finish it, remember to bring water with you in the future." Emo Chenga took it and answered in a low voice. After a while, the coachman who was feeding the horses came and respectfully asked Liu Shan, "Master Immortal, where will we stay tonight?" Liu Shan only raised his eyes. "We'll continue our journey tonight and rest at dawn." The coachman was obviously unwilling, but he didn't dare to offend him. He bowed and said, "Master Immortal, it's late and I can't see. It's not easy to hurry." This time, Liu Shan didn't even look at him. He just threw him a white stone. "Put it away. It can shine." The coachman nodded repeatedly. Emo Chenga looked up. Although she was curious, she didn't say anything. The cultivation world was still a strange world to her, so she was curious about everything. "Okay, let's go." After eating, Liu Shan clapped his hands and grabbed Emo Chenga to return to the carriage. He muttered, "Unfortunately, I don't know light body technique. Otherwise I wouldn't need a carriage." Emo Chenga had a rough understanding of what light body technique was. It was a type of spell that allowed one to fly and float in the air. The two cultivators who were fighting with each other on the way were using this spell. However, only those who reached the 5th layer of the aura refining realm could practice it, so Liu Shan could only go to Kunwu with the help of secular tools. Just as he was about to set off, a green light suddenly flashed through the air, carrying with it a dense aura and might. Liu Shan suddenly got out of the carriage and gazed at the green light that flashed by. For a while he was speechless. It wasn't until the light disappeared on the horizon that he let out a sigh of relief. He's actually a foundation-building cultivator. Why did he come to the secular world? After muttering to himself for a long time, he finally didn't dare to look for another opportunity to take advantage of him. After all, for low-level cultivators like them, a foundation-building cultivator was like a celestial being. This secular carriage carrying two low-level aura-refining cultivators staggered on the road. The foundation-building cultivator who flashed by simply didn't pay any attention to these low-level cultivators. Not long after he arrived at Lianqing. After asking for directions, he went straight to the small village in the direction of Feiyun town. Emo Chenga didn't know that 2 days after she disappeared, a cultivator actually came to the Emo family's village where she lived for 10 years. In the Emo family's ancestral house, the young masters of the Emo family gathered in the hall, which was a rare occurrence. Patriarch Emo, who was sitting in the main seat, was frowning and smoking a pipe. After a long time, the patriarch finally put down his pipe and asked the eldest young master, "Eldest, what do you think?" The eldest young master also frowned and asked with some uncertainty, "Father, should we still look for her?" Right after he said that, someone on the side snorted indifferently. "Oh, she's been abducted for 2 days. Even if we know she was abducted, where are we going to look for her? Besides, who's going to look for her?" This time, even the eldest young master didn't say anything. On the day Emo Chenga was abducted, Tianxiao saw that Emo Chenga still hadn't returned at night, so she anxiously told her father about Emo Chenga going to town. It wasn't good to look for Emo Chenga in the middle of the night, and when there was still no news the next day, Patriarch Emo had no choice but to ask his eldest son to go to town and ask around. In the end, when he asked around, he only learned that a girl was taken away by a man at a tea stall at the town gate yesterday. According to the man's description, the girl looked like Emo Chenga. As for where she went, nobody knew. Now that it was confirmed that the child was abducted, Patriarch Emo called his sons over to discuss what to do about this matter. Although they weren't close to this child, she was still their family, so they couldn't just ignore her. However, the young masters all thought that if they wanted to look for her, first, they simply didn't know where the child was taken. Second, it was spring plowing, so whoever went to look for her would lose a lot of labor, which would reduce their harvest. Therefore, although they weren't opposed to looking for her, they didn't want to do it themselves. The first part of his words made sense. After abducting a child, the kidnapper would naturally go somewhere else immediately. How could it be that easy to find her? Patriarch Emo also understood that this wasn't the first time a child was abducted in the village. Every time they looked for her, they couldn't find her. But if they didn't look for her, it wouldn't be reasonable. In any case, she was his granddaughter. Moreover, the son-in-law they recruited back then wasn't a simple person. If he came back one day, how could they explain it to him? But if they wanted to look for her, who should they send to look for her? With his brows wrinkled, the patriarch's gaze swept back and forth between his sons. As soon as the young masters saw the patriarch's gaze falling on them, they lowered their heads for fear that their names would be called. Before the patriarch could make a decision, Uncle he ran in from outside. "Master, there's a guest." Everyone in the room didn't have time to ask because they already saw someone stride into the hall. The person was a young man in his early 20s. He wore a blue robe and a white coat and carried a long sword on his back. Even without taking a closer look, he already emitted a threatening aura. Seeing the young man carrying a sword, the patriarch hastily stood up. "May I ask this young master?" Before he could finish speaking, the young man already said, "Are you the village head?" Patriarch Mo promptly nodded. Seeing the young man's exquisite clothes and long sword on his back, he knew he must be an expert swordsman. He asked respectfully, "May I know who you are?" The young man didn't answer. Instead, he continued to ask, "Let me ask you, do you have a daughter who recruited a son-in-law with the surname Yi?" When this question was asked, not only the patriarch but everyone in the hall also looked bewildered. They naturally knew who the young man was talking about, but their brother-in-law had been gone for 10 years without any news. What did he have to do with the young man in front of them? The patriarch quickly regained his composure and answered, "Yes, but my son-in-law went out 10 years ago and hasn't come back since." After he finished speaking, he felt a bit restless. He knew that son-in-law had some background, so he was afraid the young man in front of him was here to seek revenge. Unexpectedly, the young man in front of him smiled and cupped his hands towards the patriarch. Ever since he came in, not only did he not salute the people in the hall, but he also didn't greet them. However, they didn't think he was impolite. They only felt that he wasn't an ordinary person. Now that he cupped his hands, the patriarch felt a bit relieved. It seemed he wasn't here to seek revenge. The young man said, "Village head Mo, my surname is also Yi. I was entrusted by your son-in-law to pick up his wife and daughter. May I know where they are?" Hearing this, the patriarch was a bit scared. He was just thinking about how it would be hard to explain his lost granddaughter to her father when he returned. Why did someone suddenly come to ask for them? After pondering for a while, the patriarch asked cautiously, "So it's young Master Yi. May I know where my son-in-law is now? Why didn't he come back with them?" The young man's smile disappeared. He sighed and said, "Village head Mo, I'll tell you the truth. Senior Yi has already passed away. My martial uncle and Senior Yi were friends who went through thick and thin together. Before Senior Yi died, he entrusted my martial uncle to take his wife and daughter and give them to his brother. I came here on my martial uncle's orders." This news caused everyone in the hall to be astonished. Senior Yi had been gone for 10 years and hadn't come back. They had long suspected that he might have met with an accident. Now that they knew he was dead, they were mentally prepared. However, this young man said he came to pick up people and even wanted to take them away, which made them feel strange. The patriarch also felt the same. He asked, "Young Master Yi, my son-in-law married into your family, so my daughter and granddaughter are naturally members of the Mo family. Why did he mention taking them away?" The young man smiled again. This time, there was a hint of pride in his smile. "Stay here? Village head Mo, could it be that you don't know your son-in-law isn't immortal?" This news surprised everyone even more. The young masters of the Mo family were shocked. One of them couldn't help but ask, "If he's not immortal, then what is he?" "Of course he's an immortal." The young man glanced at him. "Don't tell me you don't know that Senior Yi has the power of immortality?" Everyone shook their heads. The young man raised his hand, and a ball of flame suddenly appeared in his hand. He then swung it and the sword on his back suddenly flew out and flicked the ball of flame. The flame was extinguished, and the sword flew back into its scabbard. The young man said, "Do you believe me?" There were many legends about immortals in the secular world. Now that they saw this kind of power of immortality with their own eyes, how could they not believe it? The patriarch had long felt that his son-in-law wasn't ordinary, so how could he not believe him? Suddenly he remembered that his granddaughter was kidnapped. If this young master was really an immortal, wouldn't it be very easy to find her? With this thought in mind, the patriarch hastily said, "Young Master Yi, we believe you. It's just that my daughter was unlucky. She died of a serious illness 3 years ago, and my granddaughter was kidnapped by kidnappers 2 days ago. You know the power of immortality, so please save her." The young man was shocked. He then sighed and said, "When Senior Yi entrusted her to me, He was also worried that Madame Yi had already passed away. Forget it. Tell me, what's the matter with your granddaughter? Patriarch Mo immediately told him what his son had found out. When he was done, he asked, "Young master, you see?" The young man just waved his hand and said, "I'll go first." Without saying much, he turned around and left, leaving behind a room full of bewildered people. Chapter 20. The youth surnamed Yi arrived at Feiyun town under the cover of night and knocked on the door of the tea stall owner. Then he went to the only inn in the town and dragged the innkeeper out of bed. "Young master, the person you mentioned indeed lived in my shop for almost half a month, but he left 2 days ago. A little girl indeed came to see him several days ago, but that day the customer happened to be leaving, so the two of them went out together. I don't know where they went." "Do you know where this person came from?" "I don't know. I only know that the customer seems to be traveling around and is a bit mysterious." The youth thought for a moment, then asked, "Then do you know how he left? Did he ride a horse or ride a carriage?" "That customer hired a carriage to go to town. Oh, I remember now. His coachman said mysteriously that the customer wasn't a mortal, but I don't know why." The youth had already made up his mind. This person wasn't an ordinary kidnapper, but a cultivator. He didn't know what he wanted to do by kidnapping this little girl. Young master asked where the customer went. "I have a guess. We only have one road to Lianqing, so no matter where the customer wants to go, he'll most likely go to Lianqing first before deciding where to go." The youth nodded and threw a piece of gold to the innkeeper. He turned around and jumped out of the window, startling the innkeeper so much that he dropped the piece of gold. "This is not a mortal." At this time the youth remembered the carriage he met on the road. When he used his divine sense to scan the carriage, he found there were 2 low-level cultivators on the carriage. However, he thought they were ordinary individual cultivators wandering in the secular world, so he didn't care about them at all. Now that he thought about it, they were probably the person he was looking for. However, he had some doubts in his heart. There were 2 cultivators and 1 mortal on the carriage. The mortal was naturally the coachman. Could it be that the little girl had also become a cultivator? With this doubt in mind, he drove his flying sword towards that road. It was pitch black inside the carriage, but there was a faint light outside. Mo Chenga curiously leaned against the window and looked at the stone the coachman put in the lamp. This was a moonlight stone. In the immortal cultivation world, it was not a very precious item. Many people used it as a decoration in their immortal's cave. However, in the secular world, it was a treasure that was hard to find even with 1,000 gold. She couldn't help but secretly take out the glass bead, only to discover that it was useless against this moonstone. It seemed that the reason why it glowed wasn't because of the spiritual aura. The glass bead felt cold in his hand. Under the moonlight, it emitted a misty white light, as if it was absorbing spiritual energy. Unfortunately, even if she absorbed all of it now, she couldn't use it. Her meridians were blocked, and spiritual energy couldn't enter at all. She sighed helplessly and raised her head to look at the full moon in the sky. However, the next moment she was startled. That moon, there was a person flying on the moon. Before he could figure out what was going on, the figure suddenly swooped down, and the coachman in front pulled on the reins. The carriage jolted and came to a stop. Li Yushan, who was sleeping, was jolted awake. He angrily shouted, "What are you doing?" The coachman's frightened voice came from outside, "Immortal master, there's someone." "Who?" Li Yushan opened the carriage door and stuck his head out. However, he was also startled. He saw a young man standing in front of the carriage. Judging from his momentum, he was definitely a foundation-building expert. Li Yushan hastily got off the carriage and cupped his hands. "Junior Li Yushan greets senior." The young man nodded and said, "There's another person in the carriage. Why doesn't she get off?" Li Yushan hastily turned around and pulled Mo Chenga off the carriage. He smiled apologetically and said, "This is my younger sister. She's just a child and doesn't know any better. Please forgive her, senior." "Your younger sister?" The young man frowned slightly and his gaze fell on Li Yushan's hand. "Since she's your younger sister, why are you treating her like this? Aren't you afraid of hurting her?" Li Yushan was startled. He saw that Mo Chenga's arm was in pain, so he hastily let go. "Junior is a crude person. I was anxious and, really?" The young man's gaze swept back and forth between the two of them. Li Yushan nodded repeatedly with a respectful expression on his face. It wasn't that he hadn't seen foundation-building seniors before, but they basically ignored him, so he had only seen them from afar a few times. Seeing that this young man was already in the foundation building realm despite his young age, Liu Shan was both envious and jealous. He then looked at the young man's robe, which seemed to be the robe of a big cultivation group. Unfortunately, Liu Shan's spiritual roots were inferior, so it wasn't easy for him to enter a cultivation group, let alone reach the foundation building realm. He immediately cupped his hands respectfully and said, "May I know what Senior wants? If there's anything Junior can do for you, I won't hesitate to do so." The young man didn't answer. He just stared at them with a gaze as sharp as a knife. In the end, his gaze fell on Emo Chinga and he asked gently, "Little girl, what's your name? Can you tell me?" Emo Chinga looked at him then looked at Liu Shan. She wanted to escape from Liu Shan's evil clutches, but she was also afraid that this person wasn't a good person. Although this big brother was very kind, Liu Shan was also like this in the beginning. Liu Shan was anxious. "Senior, this is indeed my younger sister." Before he could finish, the young man let out a humph, and suddenly threw Liu Shan to the ground with a wave of his hand. Liu Shan was shocked, but before he could say anything the young man sneered and said, "Don't think I don't know you kidnapped this child." He then ignored Liu Shan and asked Emo Chinga, "Little girl, is your surname Emo and you live in Emo family's village in Lianqing?" Emo Chinga was gobsmacked. How did this person know? The young man said, "Don't be afraid. I came to pick you up on your father's request. If you have something to say, just tell me." Emo Chinga and Liu Shan were both shocked. However, one was pleasantly surprised while the other was frightened. Liu Shan only knew her father had been missing for a long time. He didn't expect that he would send someone back at this time. Moreover, he was a high-level cultivator. He couldn't help but feel regret. If only he had waited a few more days. Maybe he could have gotten some benefits. How could Emo Chinga hold back after hearing about her father? She blurted out, "My father? Where's my father? Did you come to pick me up and take me to see my father?" The young man smiled and said, "If you're a little girl from Emo family's village, then you're right." Emo Chinga nodded repeatedly. "Yes, I did." The young man was relieved that he finally found her and that she was safe. He stepped forward to size her up and asked, "Did this person kidnap you? Did he mistreat you?" Emo Chinga nodded. "It was him. He pretended to exchange insights with me and sealed the spiritual aura in my meridians. He even said he wanted me to be some kind of human furnace." The young man's expression immediately changed. He glared at Liu Shan, who had fallen on the ground. "What a scum of the cultivation world. You actually dared to have designs on such a young child." Liu Shan realized he had offended an expert. Moreover, he couldn't refute the fact that he kidnapped Emo Chinga, so he hastily said, "Senior, please wait. Listen to me." The young man sneered again. "All right, tell me. Is there anything you can't say?" "Senior, I indeed had bad intentions, but this little girl is really rare in this world. Senior, do you know that she has a purine constitution? Performing dual cultivation with her." A strong gust of wind made Liu Shan tilt his head and spit out a mouthful of blood. The young man stared at him coldly. "You actually wanted to use this to lure me? You really have evil intentions. What's the point of keeping you alive?" Liu Shan turned pale with fright. He knew the young man in front of him wanted to kill him. He immediately took out a talisman from his robe and ignited it. He immediately stood up and ran away at an extremely fast speed. The young man didn't move. The sword on his back flew out of its sheath and swiftly flew towards Liu Shan. Liu Shan cried out and fell to the ground with a thud. The sword flew back and was returned to its sheath. The young man snorted coldly at the corpse. Emo Chinga was terrified. Although she had long thought that she would hack Liu Shan into 1,000 pieces if she had the strength, seeing such a bloody scene was more frightening than satisfying. As it turned out, the difference between the foundation building realm and the aura refining realm was actually so big. She hated Liu Shan to the bone and wanted to escape from his devil's hands, but she couldn't. In front of this foundation building senior, Liu Shan was nothing more than an ant that could be killed with a wave of his hand. Chapter 21. Little girl, are you okay? The young man saw her pale face and seemed scared. He said, "The path of cultivation has always been bloody. This kind of villain can't be left alive. You need to get used to it." Emo Chinga regained her composure and tried to calm herself down. This senior was right. This kind of person wouldn't even know how to scheme against others. Besides, he wanted to harm her, so she didn't mind killing him. She looked up at the young man and asked, "Senior, are you my father's friend?" The young man smiled, bent down and said to her, "My martial uncle is your father's friend. He was entrusted by your father to send me to pick you up. This person is really related to my father. Does that mean I can leave here and live with my father?" Thinking of this, she was very happy. "Senior, will you take me to my father's place? Will I be able to see my father?" The young man was stunned. This child obviously missed her father very much. How could he tell her about his death? After thinking for a while, he finally said, "Little girl, your father has already passed away. He couldn't let go of you and your mother before he died, so he entrusted this matter to my martial uncle." Seeing that the little girl's cheerful expression suddenly froze, he couldn't bear it and comforted her. "Don't be sad. You still have an uncle?" He didn't finish his words. The little girl grabbed his sleeve and suddenly burst into tears. He was flustered. "Little girl, don't cry." He really wasn't good at coaxing children. He couldn't help but feel regretful. If he knew this would happen, he would have said it later. But now, he had no choice but to let her cry to her heart's content. He shifted his gaze to the side. The mortal coachman was shivering in fear and looked at him with a frown. He said, "You can go. We don't hurt mortals." The coachman was relieved to hear this. He thanked him profusely and hurriedly drove the carriage away. Watching the carriage go away, the young man lowered his head. The child had stopped crying and was now sobbing. Although he didn't know how to coax children, he pitied her for losing her parents at such a young age, so he said gently, "Don't be sad. I'll take you to Kunwu to see your uncle, okay?" Emo Chinga raised her tear-stained face. "Senior, I never knew what my father looked like. I cultivated diligently just to find my father, but..." The young man patted her head. "We are cultivators. We have to see through life and death. Your father has passed away. He wanted you to be well. Don't let him down." Emo Chinga shook her head then nodded. Seeing that she finally stopped crying, the young man smiled. "Then I'll take you away now, okay?" Emo Chinga hesitated. "You won't come back anymore?" Looking at her expression, the young man thought that she was reluctant to part with him. Well, even if this little girl was already a cultivator, she was still a child after all. She had lived in the secular world since childhood, so perhaps she was reluctant to part with her family in the secular world. "Since I've already stepped onto the immortal Tao, it's best that I abandon my mortal bonds. Little girl, if you are unwilling to leave, it will be very difficult for you to take another step forward in your cultivation in this mortal world." Emo Chinga shook her head. "I don't want to stay here. Aside from Tianxiao, none of them like me." The young man didn't expect that although this child looked very obedient, she was unexpectedly not lovable. "Then why do you still want to come back?" Emo Chinga said, "Tianxiao is very good to me. I want to see her again in the future." The young man smiled. "So that's how it is. That's easy. When you build your foundation, you'll be able to fly. At that time, you can come back whenever you want. Fly. Fly in the sky like him?" Emo Chinga's eyes lit up. "Really?" The young man nodded with a smile then said, "I'll take you with me. In a few days we'll reach Kunwu." Emo Chinga nodded then shook her head. "Senior, can I go home and take a look before we leave?" "Of course you can." The young man waved his hand, and the sword on his back flew out automatically. He held Emo Chinga's hand and stepped on the flying sword. "I'll take you home first." With a whoosh, the scenery in front of her suddenly changed. Emo Chinga was startled. Soon after, she saw that she was in midair. Her surroundings were pitch black, and she could vaguely see mountains and rivers below. She suddenly felt weak under her feet. Seeing her like this, the young man laughed. "Don't be afraid. With me here you won't fall." Emo Chinga's face was pale. She was scared witless, but when she heard his comforting words, she nodded reluctantly. The young man slowly talked to her to distract her. "Little girl, your surname is Emo. What's your first name?" Emo Chinga stared down without blinking and answered, "My name is Chinga. Tian as in heaven, and Ji as in song." "Emo Chinga," the young man repeated her name and said with a smile, "This name is good. My surname is the same as your father's and my name is Jingwen. You don't need to call me senior. Just call me Big Brother Yi." He then asked, "How did you cultivate? Is it the cultivation technique your father left behind?" Emo Chinga hesitated for a moment then nodded. "And I found it by accident. You might know a person's face but not his heart." After the incident with Liu Shan, she became even more careful. Yi Jingwen's gaze fell on her hand. After staring at it for a long time, he said, "The bead in your hand isn't an ordinary object. It contains spiritual aura. It's a treasure, right?" Emo Chinga was startled. Sure enough, he was in the foundation building realm. Although Li Yushan also saw it, he didn't doubt it at all. However, this big brother Yi unexpectedly saw through it at a glance. Seeing her frightened expression, Yi Jingwen smiled. Don't worry. If I wasn't trustworthy, Martial Uncle wouldn't have sent me here. I just found out you really inherited your mother's purine constitution. If I had bad intentions, I would have directly taken you away. Mo Chinga finally felt a bit relieved after hearing what he said. She said embarrassedly, Senior? Oh big brother Yi, this bead was left by my father to my mother. I also don't know what it is. I only know it can gather spiritual aura. Yi Jingwen took a second look at it then asked, Can I take a look at it? Mo Chinga thought for a moment then took off the bead and handed it to him. Yi Jingwen took it, turned it over and over again, then sent a strand of his divine sense into it. In the end, he returned it to her hand and said with a smile, If I'm not mistaken, this is a string of spirit-gathering beads. There's a spirit-gathering formation engraved inside it. It's indeed a treasure for low-level cultivators, but it's useless for high-level cultivators. Presumably, your father left it with your mother in the hope that she wouldn't suffer any disasters or illnesses and could prolong her life. Unfortunately, Mo Chinga silently put the bead away. She knew her mother's illness couldn't be cured, it could only prolong her life. She raised her head and looked at Yi Jingwen. She thought for a moment then asked, Big brother Yi, is my father really an immortal? What about you guys? Of course. Your father is a core formation cultivator, a famous cultivator in West Kunwu. Seeing that Mo Chinga's eyes lit up, he smiled and said, As for me, I'm a disciple of Shenqing School. My martial uncle is Master Daoist Shoujing, an elder of Shenqing School. My martial uncle is amazing. He's a rare genius who formed his gold core in 100 years in the celestial pole. Your father and my martial uncle are friends, so of course he's also amazing. Mo Chinga was a bit confused. Big brother Yi, since my father's so amazing, why would he? Yi Jingwen couldn't answer this question. He just sighed and said, The path of cultivation is really difficult and dangerous. Not only is the human heart unpredictable, but for natural treasures and fated chances, you also have to fight against the heavens. Even heaven-gifted geniuses can't guarantee they'll live forever. Seeing that Mo Chinga didn't understand, he couldn't help but laugh at himself. How could a child who hadn't experienced these things understand? As they talked, they finally arrived at Mo's village. Chapter 22. In a small town at the foot of Western Kunwu Mountain, a blue light flashed across the sky. A young man descended with a girl. They were Yi Jingwen and Mo Chinga. 2 days ago, the two of them returned to the Mo family's village. Yi Jingwen said he wanted to take Mo Chinga away, and no one in the Mo family dared to object. Soon after, Mo Chinga packed her things and bid farewell to Tianxiao. After learning all of this, Tianxiao was both envious and reluctant. Unfortunately, Yi Jingwen said she didn't have spiritual roots and couldn't cultivate. The two children could only tearfully part ways. In the past 2 days, Mo Chinga learned many things from Yi Jingwen. It turned out that her father had left 10 years ago in order to search for opportunities in a secret place. To the east of the celestial pole, there was a mountain range that was the territory of the demonic path. It was said that 100,000 years ago the righteous path and the demonic path fought a great war, and the demonic path was defeated, so they gave up Kunwu Mountain. The righteous path and devil path were separated by a mountain. To the northeast of the mountain was the devil path, and to the southwest was the leader of the righteous path, Tiandao sect. This mountain was named Demonic Mountain. It was said that Demonic Mountain was the battlefield of the great war of immortals and devils in ancient times. To this day, extremely powerful restrictions, formations, and other things were left behind. Ordinary cultivators would die as soon as they entered, but there were also many treasures left behind, so people often went there to look for fated chances. 10 years ago, the restrictions on a certain part of Demonic Mountain disappeared, and both the righteous and devil path rushed in. Mo Chinga's father, Yi Hai, left the Mo clan to go there. Unfortunately, not long after, only a small portion of the cultivators who entered this place managed to escape. It was said that the rest had all perished. Shenqing School's master Daoist Shoujing met Yi Hai on this trip, and the two of them went missing together on this mountain. Originally, many people thought that Daoist master Shoujing had unfortunately fallen. Unexpectedly, he returned safely not long ago. However, all the cultivators who went missing with him died. He also used a secret technique and almost lost all of his power to escape. As soon as he returned to Shenqing School, Master Daoist Shoujing lost a lot of his cultivation, so he had no choice but to immediately enter closed-door meditation. It was said that he owed Yi Hai a great favor for being able to escape this time, so he sent Yi Jingwen to make arrangements for his funeral. From Yi Jingwen, Mo Tiange learned that there was still a bloodline on her father's side. Yi clan was originally a cultivation clan from Mount Qingmeng in western Kunwu. However, their population was sparse and in the end only 2 brothers were left. In the past, when Yi Hai was still alive, he had an awe-inspiring reputation, so no one dared to bully him. However, 10 years ago the news of Demonic Mountain's disappearance spread. Yi clan lost its only core formation cultivator and couldn't gain a foothold in Mount Qingmeng. The last cultivator had no choice but to move his clan to the secular world and become an individual cultivator. This cultivator was Yi Hai's younger brother, Mo Tiange's uncle. When you find your uncle, you'll follow me back to Mount Taikang. You can either join Shenqing School or rebuild your clan. Yi Jingwen told her that Shenqing School was one of the 7 great cultivation groups in the Celestial Pole. With Shenqing School as their backing, they weren't afraid of being bullied. There were 7 great cultivation groups in the Celestial Pole. Among them, Tiandao sect was the most powerful, and Shenqing School was second only to it. Tiandao sect could be said to be the #1 cultivation group in West Kunwu. Mo Tiange didn't have any objections. She had waited for so long to find out that her father was no longer around. Now, as long as she could leave that house, she did not care where she went. If there was anything to look forward to, it would be having an uncle. They set out from the Mo family's village for 2 days and finally arrived here. Yi Jingwen had said that there were immortal cultivators here. Mo Tiange looked around curiously, but she discovered that this was just an ordinary town. Yi Jingwen saw her disappointed expression and said with a smile, "These are just mortals. How can mortals see the residence of immortals?" He then led her into a dilapidated small temple. Mo Tiange also didn't find anything unusual about this small temple. Yi Jingwen took out a jade pendant from his robe and handed it to Mo Tiange. "This is a gift from my martial uncle. In the future, don't let this thing leave your body. If you carry it with you, even nascent soul seniors won't be able to see through your constitution." Mo Tiange took it. The jade pendant was round and had a warm jade color. It was painted with cloud patterns and tied with a red string. She turned it over and found a small Qin character was carved in the middle of the other side. Yi Jingwen said, "My martial uncle's surname is Qin. People call him Qin Shoujing." He waved his hand and the scene in front of them suddenly changed. The statue of a god that had fallen to the ground in the temple disappeared and was replaced by a street. Yi Jingwen pulled her hand. "Let's go." This looked like an ordinary street in a small town. It didn't look like a place where immortals lived at all. Yi Jingwen smiled when he heard what Mo Tiange said. The so-called immortals are just people who haven't become immortals yet. These markets in the secular world are places where individual cultivators gather. Generally, they don't have any powerful forces, so of course they don't have any style to speak of. As soon as the 2 of them entered the market, they attracted people's attention. It was because of Yi Jingwen's momentum and the clothes he was wearing. A foundation-building expert wearing Shenqing School's Taoist robe was really enviable. Along the way, Mo Tiange found that this place was different from the secular world. For example, the people who set up stalls on the streets would sell all sorts of strange things. Some people would only hang out a sign saying what they were selling. There were also people who would lead birds and beasts that had never been seen in the secular world. However, there weren't many of them. Yi Jingwen led her through the streets and alleys without looking sideways until they finally entered a shop. The shop was huge. She didn't know what they were selling. She only saw a tall counter but nothing else. As soon as she entered the shop, Mo Tiange saw that the shop assistant who guarded the counter was wearing clothes similar to Yi Jingwen's. He also wore a blue robe and a white coat, but his clothes weren't as exquisite as Yi Jingwen's. Mo Tiange could also sense that his cultivation level wasn't much higher than hers. As soon as they came in, the counter assistant took a careful look at them and came out to salute Yi Jingwen, calling him martial uncle. Yi Jingwen nodded and asked, "Where's the shopkeeper?" This shop assistant was obviously also a disciple of Shenqing School. He hurriedly invited them in and said, "Martial Uncle Chen is upstairs. Martial Uncle, this way please." When they went upstairs, Mo Tiange saw that the second floor was the same as the first floor. It was full of counters, but there were many chairs on the side, which seemed to be a place to receive guests. The shop assistant led them to a corner where an old man in his 50s or 60s stood. He respectfully reported, "Martial Uncle Chen, a martial uncle from our school has arrived." The old man seemed to be dozing off. When he opened his eyes and saw Yi Jingwen, he became spirited and ordered the shop assistant, "Go and serve tea." "Yes," the shop assistant answered and retreated. Seeing that Yi Jingwen was wearing their school's high-level disciple uniform and was so young, the old man didn't dare to neglect him. He stood up, cupped his hands and said, "Junior Marshal brother, I'm the shopkeeper here. My surname is Chen and my name is Yoli. May I ask which master Taoist you belong to and why did you come here?" Yi Jingwen returned the greeting and said, "I'm Yi Jingwen of Clear Spring Peak. I came here on Marshal Uncle Shoujing's order to inquire about a certain person." Upon hearing the three words Clear Spring Peak, the old man didn't dare to neglect him even more. Clear Spring Peak was the cultivation place of Patriarch Jinghe. This patriarch's temper had always been bad and he was very protective. "Junior Marshal brother Yi, do you have an identity tablet?" Yi Jingwen nodded, then took out a palm-sized jade tablet from his robe and handed it over. After the old man verified that there was no mistake, he returned the identity tablet to Yi Jingwen and invited the two of them into a private room covered with restrictions. "Junior Marshal brother Yi, please speak." Yi Jingwen admired Qin Yoli's cautious manner, so his tone became a lot more amiable. "Senior Marshal brother Qin, the person we're looking for is an individual cultivator named Yi Jiang. His cultivation level is in the foundation building realm and he's quite old. His appearance should be around 50 years old. Reportedly, someone saw him passing through this place." Qin Yoli stroked his beard and pondered for a moment before he said, "Junior Marshal brother, please wait here for a moment. I'll send a disciple to inquire about him." Yi Jingwen nodded. "Senior Marshal brother, please." Qin Yoli withdrew and once again ordered someone to bring tea. Mo Tiange was very surprised to see that this tea actually contained spiritual aura. Yi Jingwen said to her, "This is just a tea plant cultivated in a place with spiritual aura. It's not a rare species." "Oh," Mo Tiange said, then asked, "Big brother Yi, is this a shop run by your school?" Yi Jingwen answered, "Yes. We have shops in every market square. If disciples outside need help, they can look for the shopkeeper." The two of them waited for a while before Qin Yoli came in. Chapter 23. Qin Yoli came in and said to Yi Jingwen, "Junior Marshal brother Yi, is the person you mentioned a cultivator from Mount Qingming's Yi family?" Yi Jingwen nodded. "Yes." "Senior Marshal brother Qin, have you heard about him?" Qin Yoli smiled. "Yes, he bought something from our shop not long ago." Yi Jingwen was pleasantly surprised. "When did that happen? Where did he go?" Qin Yoli said, "About a month ago he came to our shop with a friend. From their conversation, one of them was a cultivator from Mount Qingming's Yi family, and the other was also from a cultivation family. His surname was Lu. They seemed to be close friends and the cultivator surnamed Lu came to see Yi Jiang off. As for where he went after that, we don't know." Yi Jingwen thought for a moment and understood what happened. When Marshal Uncle Shoujing asked his disciples to gather information, he learned that Yi Hai went missing on Demonic Mountain. A few years later, other cultivation families from Mount Qingming came to bully them and wanted to drive them out of Mount Qingming's spirit veins. The only cultivator left in the Yi clan was Yi Hai's younger brother, Yi Jiang. This Yi Jiang was not as talented as Yi Hai and could only barely cultivate to the foundation building realm. How could a foundation building cultivator fight against those clans that had core formation cultivators? Yi Jiang had no choice but to send all the mortals in his family to the secular world, separating them from the cultivation world and letting them enjoy glory and wealth in the secular world while he himself became an individual cultivator. He was already old, so he no longer thought about advancing and only traveled around. The last time he was seen was near Mount Qingming. Qin Yuli saw him thinking, so he suggested another idea. "Junior Marshal brother Yi, they're very familiar with each other. As far as I know, there's also a cultivation family surnamed Lu in Mount Qingming. That cultivator surnamed Lu might be from that family. How about you go to the Lu family and ask?" Yi Jingwen didn't have any other way, so he thought this idea was feasible. He said, "Thank you for your advice, Senior Marshal brother Qin. May I ask where the Lu family is? What does that cultivator surnamed Lu look like? What's his cultivation level like?" Qin Yuli stroked his beard. "The Lu family is located on the west side of Mount Qingming. Junior Marshal brother, if you see a mountain shaped like a palm, that cultivator surnamed Lu will be there. According to the disciple who received him, that cultivator surnamed Lu is also in the foundation building realm like Yi Jiang. They look about the same age and it seems he also doesn't have long to live." Yi Jingwen nodded and stood up. Thank you, Senior Brother Chin. I'll leave now. Goodbye. I wouldn't dare, I wouldn't dare. Chin Yuli shook his head repeatedly. Since we're from the same sect, this is what I should do. Junior brother, have a safe journey. Yi Jingwen cupped his hands to bid farewell. He then led Mo Chenga out of the market square, got on his flying sword and continued on their journey. Big brother Yi, are we going to Mount Qingming? Yeah, go find someone to ask about your uncle. You'll be able to find him soon. Mo Chenga hesitated for a moment before she raised her head and asked, Big brother Yi, why must my uncle leave Mount Qingming? Is it because he can't beat others? Before answering, Yi Jingwen hesitated for a moment, but in the end he told the truth. You should know that the cultivation world is a world where strength is respected. Spirit veins, cultivation techniques, and natural treasures are all obtained by those who are capable. The spirit vein of Mount Qingming is quite good, so it was divided among the cultivation clans. If you don't have the corresponding ability, you won't be able to enjoy this benefit. Just like Li Yushan? She muttered to herself, because he's stronger than me, I can only listen to him. If I'm stronger than him, I can make him listen to me or even kill him. Yi Jingwen didn't answer for a long time. He remembered when he entered the school when he was a child. Because he didn't have a backer, he was always bullied by high-level disciples. Later, he cultivated diligently every day and finally shone brilliantly in the school's minor competition. From then on, he became Master Daoist Qingyuan's disciple. From then on, he was a cut above the others. Those who bullied him in the past sent him gifts to apologize and change their arrogance. He also remembered this little girl's background. Both her parents were dead, and there was no one who loved her in that family in the secular world. Moreover, she had a purine constitution. It could be imagined that if people found out about this, she wouldn't be able to live a peaceful life. He sighed and said, Yes, only when you're strong enough can you control your own fate. Otherwise, it'll be decided by others. Mo Chenga nodded calmly. I understand. At this moment, a tall mountain appeared under their feet. This mountain was more than 1,000 feet high and had several peaks that pierced the clouds. It was surrounded by spiritual aura, a sea of clouds and a lush green mountain. It seemed to live up to its name as a celestial mountain. Yi Jingwen circled the mountain on his sword. Sure enough, he saw a mountain on the west side that looked like a giant palm. The top of the mountain was like 5 fingers, and there was a pavilion in the center of the palm. He took a look and flew towards that place. As soon as the two of them landed, they saw an aura refining cultivator coming to greet them. Greetings, Senior. Yi Jingwen uttered an N, then asked, Are you from Lu clan? This cultivator was only in the second layer of the aura refining realm, but he seemed to be about 50 years old. Apparently, his aptitude was poor and he had no hope of advancing, so he was specially here to welcome guests. Although this cultivator's cultivation level was low, he was very discerning. When he saw Yi Jingwen's clothes were embroidered with taiji clouds, he immediately recognized him as a disciple of Shenqing school. Moreover, he was already in the foundation building realm at such a young age, so he must be an elite disciple. Thus he was very polite. Yes. May I know Senior's distinguished name and why you've come to visit Lu clan? Yi Jingwen said, I'm Yi Jingwen, a disciple of Shenqing school. I came here to look for someone. The old man asked enthusiastically, May I know who Senior is looking for? As long as I know him, I'll definitely tell you everything I know. Yi Jingwen also bluntly said, The person I'm looking for should also be a cultivator of your Lu clan. His cultivation level is in the foundation building realm, and his appearance and age are about the same as yours. Do you have a name? I don't. An awkward expression appeared on the old man's face. To be honest, although Lu clan isn't a big clan, we still have about 10 foundation building cultivators, and there are also 6 or 7 people who match your age. May I know why Senior is here? He didn't have a name, so he obviously wasn't an acquaintance. Moreover, he only had an approximate age. The old man looked at Yi Jingwen with a bit of vigilance. He was obviously worried that Yi Jingwen had come to seek revenge. How could Yi Jingwen not know? He immediately took out a jade bottle from his robe and said, I'm looking for someone because I want to ask him about another person. If you can find that person, here are 10 aura-nourishing pills as a reward. Looking at the jade bottle, the old man couldn't help but feel a bit envious. Although aura-nourishing pills were the most common medicinal pills for aura-refining cultivators, it wasn't easy for a small cultivator like him to obtain them. Moreover, there were 10 of them and Lu clan was only allocated 1 every month. He immediately smiled and said, Senior, please come in and take a seat. Yi Jingwen showed a faint smile. He led Mo Chenga into the guest room, where spiritual tea was immediately served. May I know where Senior heard about this person? I'll analyze it with you. Maybe I can figure it out. Yi Jingwen said, about a month ago, this person and a friend came to the market square at the foot of the mountain in Shenqing School's shop. The old man thought for a while, then said, apart from the foundation building seniors of my Lu clan who are cultivating enclosed-door meditation and not at home, I think I know who they are. Upon seeing his gaze, Yi Jingwen threw the jade bottle in his hand. That being the case, I'll have to trouble you to introduce me. The old man was overjoyed when he caught the bottle and said, Senior, please wait here for a moment. I'll be back soon. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.